The read you make in 2 seconds. Someone walks into the room, and before they have said a word, you already know something. Whether they want to be here, whether they are performing, whether you will get along. You could not defend it in court, and you could not name what you noticed. But the read has already happened, and it will color everything that follows. This is thin slicing, the mind's ability to pull a conclusion from almost nothing, and it is not superstition. Your nervous system is reading real data, the speed of a breath, where the weight sits in the shoulders, whether the eyes crinkle when the mouth moves. These are cheap to observe and expensive to fake, which is exactly why the brain learned to trust them. The trouble is not that the read is fast. The trouble is that it feels finished. You stop collecting evidence the moment the verdict arrives, and everything the person does afterward gets sorted into the folder you opened in the first 2 seconds. A quiet moment becomes proof they dislike you. A nervous laugh becomes proof they are hiding something. And when your own history is involved, when they remind you of someone who hurt you, you are no longer reading them at all. You are reading your past with their face on it. The same fast machinery that reads a stranger in 2 seconds keeps running quietly in the background, even with people you already know well, updating a verdict formed years ago and rarely being asked to show its evidence. The read is still useful. Treat it as the first line of a page rather than the last. Notice the verdict, name it silently, and then go looking for the thing that would prove it wrong. If nothing contradicts it after 20 minutes, you were probably right. If something does, you just saved yourself a year of misreading a person you never actually took the time to meet. Where their eyes go first. A group forms, someone tells a joke, and in the half second after the laugh lands, watch where each person looks. They are not looking at the funniest person. They are looking at whoever they need approval from. The eyes go to the center of gravity in the room, and that center is almost never the person with the title. This is one of the cheapest reads available to you, and almost nobody uses it. Attention flows uphill. In any group, people check the face of the one whose reaction decides whether the moment was acceptable, and they do it without deciding to, in the gap before their own expression settles. A new employee looks at their manager. A manager looks at the one person on the team they quietly fear. A couple at dinner. One of them checks the other after every opinion. Watch it 3 or 4 times, and the whole hierarchy of a room draws itself. What people say about who is in charge is a story. Where their eyes go is the fact. The trap is assuming this makes someone weak. It does not. Everyone does it, including you, and the person checking is often just the one paying the most attention. But when the checking is constant, when someone cannot finish a sentence without glancing over, you are watching a person who has learned that their own read of the room is not safe to trust. This also works in reverse, since watching who checks your face after they speak tells you plainly whose reaction they have already decided matters, often before either of you has noticed the checking was happening at all. Next time you are in a group, stop listening for a moment and just track the eyes after something lands. You will learn more about the real shape of that room in 30 seconds of watching than in an entire hour of conversation. The warmth that arrives too fast. You meet someone, and within 10 minutes they are calling you a friend, telling you something private, saying they can already tell you are one of the good ones. It feels wonderful. It also feels slightly off, and you talk yourself out of the second feeling because the first one is so pleasant. Warmth has a natural speed. Real closeness is built in layers. A little disclosure, a little reciprocity, a pause to see what the other person does with it, and the pace itself is information. When someone skips the layers, they are not necessarily working an angle. Some people are lonely. Some are simply built at a faster tempo than you are. Some grew up where affection was the only currency that bought safety, and they learned to spend it fast. But fast warmth does one reliable thing, regardless of intent. It creates obligation. You have been given something, so now you owe something, and the debt arrives before you decided whether you wanted the gift. That is why the technique is standard for anyone who needs your trust on a schedule. Recruiters, salespeople, anyone selling certainty. The cost of misreading this is not embarrassment. It is that you match their pace, hand over your own story, and find yourself close to someone you have not actually assessed. The discomfort sitting underneath the pleasant surface is not paranoia. It is your own nervous system correctly noticing that trust is being asked for faster than any evidence has actually arrived to support it. Watch what happens when you do not match it. Stay warm, stay friendly, and simply do not return the disclosure at the same depth. A person who wanted connection will slow down and stay. A person who wanted leverage will cool noticeably, and you will have your answer inside a week at almost no cost to you at all, which is about as clean a test as this list has to offer. How they greet someone serving them. The waiter arrives. Watch the face, not the words. Does it stay open? Or does something close, a fraction of attention withdrawn, the eyes returning to you before the sentence is finished? It takes 2 seconds, and it is the most reliable character read available in ordinary life. People perform for those who can affect them and relax around those who cannot. That is not cynicism. It is how status works in the nervous system, and it means the version of someone you meet across a table has been calibrated for you. The waiter gets the uncalibrated version. So does the cleaner, the driver, the person on the phone who cannot help. Whatever shows up there sits closer to the resting state because there was no reason to build anything else. What you are reading is not politeness. Plenty of people say thank you flawlessly while never once looking at the person they are thanking. You are reading whether the other person registered as a person at all. The trap is treating one bad moment as a verdict. Someone can be short with a waiter because they are having the worst day of their year, and that tells you nothing. Look for the pattern, and look for what happens afterward. Do they correct themselves? Do they notice? Do they mention it later, when nobody would have noticed if they had not? This is also why people who were once powerless themselves so often make the gentlest superiors, since they still remember exactly what the uncalibrated version of being overlooked felt like from the other side of the counter. The next time you are deciding whether to trust someone new, stop evaluating how they treat you. You are the audience, so of course the performance is good. Watch the 3 seconds they spend with someone who has nothing at all to give them, and take that as the real number. The compliment with a hook in it. You are told you look great, so much better than last time. That the presentation was strong, especially considering. That you are surprisingly good at this. The praise lands, and something underneath it does not, and you spend the drive home trying to work out why a nice thing left a mark. A compliment with a hook does 2 jobs at once. It gives you something, and it quietly establishes who is doing the giving. The word that carries the hook is usually small and easy to defend. Surprisingly. Actually. Finally. For someone like you. Challenge it, and the person can look wounded and say they were being kind, and technically they were. This is why it works and why it is so hard to name in the moment. What is happening underneath is a claim about position. To evaluate someone is to stand above them, and a hooked compliment lets a person take that position while appearing generous. Some do it deliberately. Far more do it because they are anxious about their own standing, and the only way they know to feel level with you is to hand you something with a weight attached. The cost of not noticing is that you begin managing your behavior around the hook, dressing for the person who mentioned your clothes, playing down wins around the person who is surprised by them. A reliable test is asking whether you would repeat the exact sentence back to a stranger and have it land as plain kindness, since a compliment that only works once the hierarchy is understood was never entirely about you in the first place. Notice the residue. When praise leaves you feeling smaller instead of steadier, go back and find the small word. You do not have to say anything about it. Knowing it was there is usually enough to stop you carrying it around as though it were plainly true. Whether they say your name. Some people use your name constantly, and some almost never do, and after a few conversations you can feel the difference without being able to point at it. The ones who never say it leave you slightly unplaced, as though you could be swapped out for someone else and the conversation would run identically. Using a name is a small act of aim. It says this is directed at you, not broadcast into the room, and the mind registers that well below the level of language. There is a reason salespeople are trained to do it, and a reason it works even when you know they were trained. But the honest version and the trained version differ in one detail. Rhythm. Genuine use is irregular. It arrives at the moments that matter, when something is being asked or offered or acknowledged. Trained use is even, sprinkled through at intervals, landing on sentences that did not need it. The absence is worth reading too, and it usually means less than you fear. Plenty of warm people simply never developed the habit, and some are quietly terrified they have the name wrong and are covering. The trap is scoring people on this alone. It is a small signal, and it breaks easily. One conversation proves nothing, and a nervous person proves less. Where it earns its keep is in change. When someone who always used your name stops, something shifted, and it shifted before they could have told you. It is worth noticing, too, that the people most careful with your name are usually just as careful with everyone else's, which means the habit is closer to a general discipline of attention than a signal reserved specially for you. Pay attention to that gap rather than to the raw frequency, and you will catch a cooling weeks before it ever announces itself in anything. Either of you would actually say out loud, giving you time to ask about it while asking is still easy. The smile that starts in the eyes. Two people smile at you on the same morning, and one of them leaves you feeling better than the other. And if asked, you could not say why. The mouths did the same thing. The difference sat higher up, in the small muscle around the eye that tightens on its own and refuses to move on command. A real smile arrives from the inside out. The eyes narrow slightly, the skin at the corners gathers, and the mouth follows a beat behind. A social smile runs the other way, mouth first, eyes uninvolved, and it appears and disappears more abruptly, like a light rather than a sunrise. You have been reading this since you were an infant, long before you had a word for it, which is why the wrong one produces an unease you cannot argue with. What matters here is not catching people out. Social smiles are not lies. They are the ordinary lubricant of daily life, and a person who only ever gave you real ones would be exhausting to be near. The read is about timing. Watch when the real one appears and you learn what actually reaches them. Which subject? Which person walking past? Which part of the conversation? Which sentence of yours landed somewhere real, rather than being politely received and set down? The trap is deciding that a stretch of social smiles means someone is false. Usually it means they are tired or guarded or working. Children are especially reliable readers of this particular difference, since nobody has yet taught them to override it with politeness, which is why a toddler can tell you in an instant which visiting adult is actually glad to be there. Stop grading the smiles and start noting the moment the eyes join in. That moment is the map. Everything the person genuinely cares about is standing exactly where you saw it quietly happen. How quickly they interrupt. There is a moment near the end of your sentence where the other person decides whether to wait. Some wait a full beat after you stop. Some arrive a syllable early, riding in on the tail of your last word. A few start while you are still in the middle of the thought. You notice all three, and you form an opinion from it before you have processed a single thing they said. Interruption gets read as plain rudeness, and sometimes that is exactly, precisely what it is. More often, it is a rhythm, learned at a family table where the pause you are waiting for never came, and the only way to say anything was to take the floor. In some households, interrupting is how enthusiasm is expressed, and waiting politely reads as boredom. A person raised in the quieter kind of house will read that same energy as an attack. So, the raw fact tells you about the room they grew up in more than about their opinion of you. What tells you about their opinion of you is selectivity. Watch whether they interrupt everyone or only certain people. Only the junior ones. Only the women. Only you. That pattern is not rhythm, it is ranking. And it is being performed for the whole room, whether or not anyone names it. It is also worth listening to what happens right after the interruption, since a person who cuts in and then genuinely absorbs what you were saying is doing something very different from one who only wanted the floor back for its own sake. The move is not to start interrupting back. It is to notice the selectivity and to stop taking the interruption personally when it turns out to be universal. And when it is not universal, you now know exactly where you sit in that person's ordering, which is information you were never, under any circumstance, going to get simply by asking. The first question they ask you. After the greeting, somebody has to go first, and whatever they reach for is not random. What do you do? How do you know the host? Are you here alone? How was the drive? Each one opens a different door, And the door someone chooses tells you what they are looking for before you have given them anything to work with. First questions come from what a person needs to establish. Some need to place you on a ladder, and those questions are about work, titles, where you live, what you drive. Some need to know whether you are safe, and those are about mutual connections, shared ground, who else you know. Some are not looking for information at all. They open a space and wait to see what you do with it, and those questions are the widest and the least common. There is also the person who asks nothing and simply begins talking, and that is its own answer. That one is usually anxious rather than arrogant, though the effect on you is identical. The trap is judging the latter question harshly. Placing people is not a character flaw. It is a nervous system trying to work out how to behave, and plenty of generous people lead with it because it is the script they were handed. Read it as a state, not a verdict. Pay attention as well to what a person does with your answer once they have it, since the same latter question can come from someone building a genuine map of your life or from someone only checking where you rank on it. What to do with this is simple and slightly mischievous. Give a short answer to their first question, then ask them the same one back. Whatever they came looking for, they will now tell you at length, and you will have learned in 2 minutes what most people take 3 separate meetings and considerable patience to finally notice. Whether they ask a second question, you answer what they asked. You mention the move, the new job, the thing that has been eating your year. And then there is a fork in the conversation that almost nobody notices while it is happening. They either go one layer down, or they take your answer as a cue to begin their own story. The second question is the cheapest test of attention that exists. The first question can be a formality, a script, something to fill the gap after a greeting. The second one costs something. It requires that the person was listening rather than waiting. It means the person actually processed the answer, found the part that mattered, and chose to stay there instead of steering back toward familiar ground. Almost nobody does it, which is why the ones who do are remembered as excellent company by people who could not explain what they did. Be careful about the harsher reading. Someone who tells their own story instead is not always self-absorbed. In many families, matching a story is how sympathy gets expressed, and the person is trying to say, "Me too, I understand. You are not alone in this." The tell is what happens next. Genuine matching comes back to you. Self-absorption keeps going. Give it 3 exchanges before you decide which of the 2 you are actually looking at. The pattern tends to travel with a person across every relationship they have, which means the friend who never asks a second question of you is very likely giving the same thin attention to everyone else who tells them something real. Try running the test deliberately once this week. Say something real, something that is not small talk, and count how many people go one layer down. It will be fewer than you expect. Those are the people worth your evenings, and you will have identified them all quietly, without ever once needing to force a single, difficult conversation to do it. How they handle a small silence. The conversation reaches a natural gap. 3 seconds, maybe 4, nothing has gone wrong, the topic has simply finished. Watch what happens in that gap, and you learn something about a person that months of talking will not tell you. Some cannot leave it alone. The silence arrives, and they fill it instantly with weather, with a joke, with a question they do not want the answer to, and the filling is not friendliness, it is discomfort with an audible shape. Silence is unstructured, and unstructured means unmanaged, and for some nervous systems, unmanaged means unsafe. Others sit in it easily. Their face stays open, they are not scrambling, and the gap becomes a rest rather than a hole. What makes this such a strong read is that it cannot be performed. You can rehearse an answer, a story, a charming line, but you cannot rehearse being comfortable, and the gap arrives without warning. The trap is thinking that comfort with silence equals depth and discomfort equals shallowness. Neither is true. Comfort with a silence can also mean a person has simply stopped caring what you think of them, which is not depth at all. Some of the warmest people alive are compulsive fillers, and some of the calmest are simply disengaged and have nothing they want to say. Read it alongside the eyes rather than on its own. The same person can behave differently in different silences, entirely comfortable in a pause with an old friend, and visibly unable to bear one with somebody new, which tells you plainly where the safety actually lives. Next time a gap opens, do not fill it. Let it run one beat longer than feels natural and watch the other person. What they reach for in that moment, and how fast, is the closest you will ever get to seeing them entirely without the arrangement they quietly made before walking in the door. The story they lead with. Everyone has one. The anecdote that comes out in the first hour with someone new, polished by repetition, timed well, reliably successful. The disaster holiday. The job they walked out of. The famous person they once met. It is offered as entertainment. And it is entertainment. But it is also a thesis statement. And almost nobody hears it as one. People lead with the story that makes the case they most need made. The person whose opening story is about being underestimated is telling you that being underestimated is the wound. The one who leads with chaos is telling you they want to be read as someone who survives things. Listen for the role they occupy in their own story, because that is the role they are asking you to give them, and they chose it long before you arrived. The tell is not the content but the polish. A story with worn edges, where the pauses land in exactly the right places, has been told many times, and things get told many times because they are load-bearing. New stories are messier. They wander, they lose the thread, and they are far more likely to be true in the way the person actually lived them. Pay attention as well to which parts of the story get a little better with each telling, since the details a person quietly upgrades over time are often the exact ones that once felt too ordinary or too painful to say plainly. What to do with this is nothing at first. Do not analyze a person out loud on the strength of one anecdote, and do not decide you have understood them. Just note the role. Then watch, over the following weeks, whether they keep casting themselves in it. If they do, you have not learned a fun fact about their past. You have learned the exact shape they need every relationship to take, including the one they have with you. Where their feet are pointing. A conversation is going well by every measure you can name. The person is facing you, nodding, asking things. Then you look down, and their feet are aimed at the door, or at the group across the room, or at the corridor they came from. The top half of them is with you. The bottom half left several minutes ago. Feet are honest because nobody manages them. Everything above the waist is under constant supervision. The face, most of all, then the shoulders, then the hands. By the time attention reaches the ankles, there is none left, and so they keep doing what the body actually wants, which is to point where it intends to go. This is old wiring. Knowing your escape route mattered long before manners did. The body still runs the calculation even in a room where nothing can hurt you. What this gives you is timing rather than judgment. Feet aimed away do not mean the person dislikes you. Usually it means they have somewhere to be, or they are anxious about something that has nothing to do with this conversation, and the polite half of them has decided not to say so. Reading it as rejection is the mistake most people make. Reading it as a clock is the useful version. This is worth watching even in people you have known for years, since the feet will announce a growing restlessness in a routine long before either of you says a word about it out loud. Watch for the moment the feet turn, because it almost always happens before anything is said. When you see it, land the conversation yourself, rather than leaving them to work out how to escape it. You will be remembered as the person who is easy to talk to. And the only thing you actually did was notice something they never knew they were showing you the entire time. The distance they choose to stand. Two people talk to you at the same event, and one of them keeps ending up closer than the other. Neither measured anything. Neither thought about it. But if you stepped back half a pace, one would follow and one would not. And that single half pace tells you more about where you stand with them than an hour of pleasant conversation. Everyone carries an invisible envelope around them, and its size is not fixed. It shrinks with familiarity, with liking, with the noise level of the room, and it expands with caution. When someone stands closer than you expected, their nervous system has already filed you as safe, or as someone worth the risk. When they hold a little extra ground, something has not been decided yet. The signal is easy to misread because culture sets the baseline. What feels intimate in one country is ordinary in another. And a person who grew up in a crowded house stands differently from one who grew up in an empty one. So the raw distance is close to meaningless. One reading of one person on one evening will tell you almost nothing at all. The change in distance is not. Watch what happens over the course of an evening. Someone who started at arm's length and ends up at your shoulder has made a decision about you. Someone who quietly restores the gap each time you close it has also made one. Neither of them will tell you, and neither of them is fully aware of it. You do not have to act on this immediately, and reading it once and drawing a firm conclusion is usually a mistake, since the envelope shifts with mood, tiredness, and the particular room, not only with how someone feels about you. Just stop treating the words as the final word, whenever the body has already, quietly, cast its own vote. When they stop mirroring you, watch two people who are enjoying each other, and you will see a slow dance nobody choreographed. One picks up a glass, the other picks up a glass. One leans in, the other follows a beat later. Their breathing drifts into the same rhythm, and neither of them notices any of it. Then watch what happens when something goes wrong. Mirroring is what agreement looks like from the outside. The body copies what it is comfortable near, and it does this automatically, below the level of decision, which is exactly why it is worth watching. It is not politeness. Politeness is what remains once mirroring has gone. What matters is the moment it stops. You say something and the mirror breaks. The other person's posture holds still, while yours moves, and the two of you fall out of step. Nothing has been said. Nothing looks wrong. But something in them just declined to come along. And that is the most precise piece of feedback you will get all week, because it arrived before they had time to decide how to frame it. Deliberate mirroring, the kind taught in sales training, is a poor imitation. It runs too fast and lands too neatly, and it feels like being copied rather than being joined. Real mirroring lags by a second or two. It is also incomplete, catching the posture but missing the gesture, because the body is following rather than copying. Notice the break, and notice what was on the table when it happened. Return to that subject later and watch again. If the mirror breaks in the same place twice, you have found something they have opinions about and are not saying. Mirroring can also fail simply because someone is tired or distracted rather than displeased, so treat the first break as a question worth holding lightly rather than a conclusion worth acting on immediately, before you actually know which one it was. The object they put between you. Somebody sits down across from you and, without appearing to think about it, arranges a cup, a bag, a laptop, a folded coat into the space between. It looks like tidying. It is not tidying. It is a wall, assembled out of whatever was available, and it went up before either of you said anything of consequence. You will not remember it happening. You will only remember that the meeting felt harder than it should have. Barriers are the cheapest form of self-protection the body has. Crossed arms are the obvious version and the most overread one, because arms get crossed when people are cold, when chairs have no rests, when someone simply finds it comfortable. Objects are better evidence, because moving them takes a small, deliberate action that serves no other purpose. Nobody has ever adjusted a coffee cup because the room was cold. They did it because something in them wanted a shape in the middle of the table. What the barrier means is almost never hostility. Most often, it is uncertainty. A person who has not yet worked out how this conversation is going to go, and would like something to stand behind while they find out. The read that matters is what happens to it later. Watch whether the wall comes down. A cup moved aside, a bag lowered to the floor, a laptop closed and pushed away. These are the moments a conversation actually changed, and they happen without comment from anyone. Notice when it happens, and notice what you had just said. That is the thing that made them feel safe enough to open the gate. It is worth knowing, because it will almost certainly work again. And the same barrier will keep quietly reappearing at the start of every difficult conversation until the underlying uncertainty it is guarding has actually, properly been addressed. The hand that goes to the neck. You ask something ordinary, and the person's hand travels up, touches the side of the throat, adjusts a collar that did not need adjusting, or rests briefly at the notch between the collarbones. The words that follow are calm. The hand was not. Of everything the body does under mild stress, this is the most consistent and the least noticed. The front of the neck is the most exposed part of a person, and covering it is one of the oldest self-soothing moves there is. It shows up when someone is uncertain, when they are choosing between two answers, when a question has landed somewhere it was not supposed to land. Women more often touch the notch. Men more often rub the back of the neck or run a hand down the throat. But the trigger is identical. Children do it too, long before anyone teaches them anything about hiding, which is how you know it is not a habit, but a reflex. Do not turn this into lie detection. It is not that. The hand goes up during discomfort, and discomfort has 100 causes, most of them innocent. Someone can be entirely honest and still find your question unpleasant. What you have found is a pressure point, not a lie. That is still worth a great deal. Note the question that produced it, and note that the person may not be able to tell you why it bothered them. If you care about them, do not press it in the moment. Come back to that subject another day, when there is no audience, and ask it more gently. You will usually find something real waiting there, something the person could not have simply told you outright in the moment it first showed up, because they had not yet managed to name it clearly enough to themselves either, let alone to you. The breath you can hear change. Sit close enough to anyone for long enough, and you begin to hear their breathing without listening for it. It runs underneath the conversation like a bass line, and most of the time it stays where it is. Then a subject arrives, and the line moves. A breath held a fraction too long. An exhale that comes before the sentence needed one. A quick, shallow intake before an answer that is supposed to be casual. Breathing sits on the border between automatic and controlled, which makes it uniquely useful. You can override it, but only while you are paying attention, and nobody pays attention to their own breathing while also building a sentence. So it leaks. It leaks in the direction of whatever the person is actually feeling, not the direction they intended to present. Stress shortens it and moves it up into the chest. Relief drops it back down. A held breath is almost always a decision being made in the half second before speech. Something is being weighed, and the weighing costs air. This is the most intimate read on this list, and the one to be most careful with. You will mostly notice it with people you are already close to, in cars and kitchens and beds, which means it will mostly tell you about people whose feelings you have some responsibility for. Do not use it to catch anyone out. Use it to know when to stop talking. When you hear the line change, and then flatten again, whatever you were saying reached them. And the most generous thing you can do next is give them a moment before you fill the space, rather than rushing in to smooth over a silence that was, in its own quiet way, doing useful, necessary work for both of you. What their jaw does while you talk. There is a small muscle at the corner of the jaw that tightens when a person is holding something back, and once you have seen it, you cannot stop seeing it. The face stays pleasant. The eyes stay on you. And just below the ear, something flexes and releases and flexes again, on a rhythm that has nothing to do with the conversation you think you are having. The jaw is where unsaid things go. It is the one place a swallowed sentence still shows on the outside. Anger, mostly, but also disagreement that has been judged too expensive to voice, and the particular strain of listening to something you believe is wrong while deciding not to say so. It is involuntary. It survives every attempt at a neutral face, and it is far more reliable than the mouth sitting directly above it. Be careful with the conclusion. A tight jaw is not necessarily about you. People arrive at conversations already carrying things, and plenty of them clench through an entire evening for reasons that started that morning. It is also the resting state of anyone in physical pain, and of a great many people who simply grind their teeth at night and have done so for 20 years. The read is in the timing. If the jaw moves at the same moment every time a particular name or subject comes up, the pattern is the message. You have found a subject that costs them something to sit through, and they have decided the cost is lower than saying so. Whether you raise it is a separate question, and mostly the answer is not now, and not in front of other people, since a jaw that tightens for a genuinely private reason rarely wants an audience for whatever finally comes after it, loosens. The coat they never take off. Someone arrives, sits down, and stays in their jacket. The room is warm. Everyone else has hung theirs up. 20 minutes in, it is still on, and it will still be on when they leave. Nobody in the room registers it consciously, and yet the conversation with that person will feel slightly different from the others, and afterward, you will not be able to say why. Something in the room stayed provisional, and everybody adjusted to it without noticing. Taking off a coat is a small commitment to staying. It costs almost nothing, and it announces something anyway, which is that this person has decided to be here for a while. Keeping it on is the opposite announcement, made by a body that has not yet agreed to settle. Sometimes it is deliberate, a person who genuinely plans to leave in 10 minutes. Far more often they have no idea they are doing it, and if you asked, they would say they simply did not think about it. That is the whole value of the signal. It was never chosen, so it was never edited. There is a gentler reading, and it is usually the true one. A coat is a layer, and people keep layers on when they feel exposed. Someone who is nervous about the meeting, unsure they were really wanted at the dinner, or braced for bad news will often stay wrapped without deciding to. So treat it as a question rather than a verdict. If someone you care about keeps their coat on in your kitchen, do not point it out. Do something that makes the room safer and watch whether it comes off, since the coat will usually answer the question all on its own, long before the person would ever think to raise it in actual spoken words. Where they put their phone: face down beside the plate, face up beside the plate, in a pocket, in a bag on the floor, in a hand, the whole time, even while nothing at all is happening on the screen. 4 people can sit at the same table making 4 different statements before anyone has said a word, and none of them thought of it as a statement. A phone on the table is a door left open. Face down is a door left open with a curtain over it, which is politeness rather than closure, and everyone at the table knows the difference, even if nobody says so. The presence of the object alone changes a conversation. It does not need to ring, light up, or do anything at all. People go shallower when a phone is visible, because some part of them has registered that the other person is reachable by someone who is not here. Watch the hand more than the phone. A phone that gets touched, turned, checked, straightened is a person managing anxiety, and often the anxiety has nothing to do with you. A phone that gets put away when you arrive is a decision made in your favor, and it is one of the clearest ones available in modern life. Somebody chose you over everyone who might text them in the next hour, and they did it without announcing it. The move is not to police anyone. It is to notice what you do with your own. Put it out of sight before the person you care about sits down, and watch what happens to the conversation you have. The change is larger than it has any right to be, given that nothing about the conversation itself was actually different except for one small object no longer sitting quietly in the middle of it, watching everything that was said. The lean that never arrives. You say something you consider interesting, something you have been waiting to tell them, and the other person stays exactly where they are. They do not pull back. They are still nodding. They may even say the right words. But the small forward movement that should have happened simply did not, and the flatness of that moment stays with you for the rest of the day. Interest has a physical shape, and the shape is a lean. You have been reading it since long before you could name it. When something genuinely catches a person, the head comes forward first, then the shoulders follow, and the distance between you closes by a few centimeters without either of you deciding anything. It is involuntary, it is fast, and it is the most honest reaction to anything you will ever say. The absence of it is not rejection, and this is where people hurt themselves unnecessarily. Some are exhausted, some are in pain. Some grew up where visible enthusiasm was unsafe and learned to keep their bodies still. The lean can be missing from a person who loves you very much. It can also be missing because they heard this story last week and did not want to say so. What it is excellent for is calibration rather than judgment. Say the same thing to 4 or 5 different people and notice where the leans happen. That is the version of your story worth telling. The rest was rehearsal. And when someone leans in for a subject you thought was minor, you have just learned what they actually want to hear about, which they will probably never tell you directly, no matter how many times you go quietly looking for it in the actual words they eventually, carefully choose to use with you. How they take up space. When seated, look around any table and you can see who feels entitled to be there before anyone speaks. One person's arm is along the back of the neighboring chair. Another has their elbows tucked, their bag on their lap, their feet under the seat, occupying roughly the volume of a folded umbrella. Both are comfortable. Both would tell you they were not thinking about it. Neither of them was. That is the entire reason it is worth looking at. Space is the physical translation of permission. Bodies expand where they feel safe and contract where they do not, and the calculation runs continuously without ever surfacing as a thought. This is why the same person occupies a different amount of a room depending on who else walked into it, and why watching one person across two settings tells you more than watching 10 people in one. The second setting is where the information lives. Do not turn this into a story about confidence. Plenty of expansive people are simply large or badly raised, and plenty of contracted ones are quietly the most capable person present, sitting small because they were taught to. The judgment is worthless. The comparison is not. What matters is never how much space a person takes, but the room in which the amount suddenly changes. Pick someone you know, and watch how much space they take at their own table, then at their parents' table, then at work. Where they shrink is where they do not feel entitled to be. That single observation will explain behavior of theirs you have found confusing for years, and you will not have to ask them a thing, because the shrinking itself is already the fuller, more honest answer than anything they would ever actually say out loud if you did ask. The nod that runs too fast. You are halfway through explaining something, and the nodding starts. Not one nod, not the slow kind that arrives at the end of a thought, but a rapid little run of them, 3 or 4 in quick succession, landing while you are still in the middle of a sentence. It reads as agreement. It is almost never agreement. Agreement is slower than that, because agreement has to arrive after the point does. Fast nodding is a request. It means please finish, or I already know this, or I need this to be over. And it comes from a person too polite to say any of those things out loud. The slow nod is the real one. It lands at the end of a point. It comes with a pause, and it means the thing you said was received and considered. The fast one is traffic management, the conversational equivalent of a hand waving a car through a junction. There is a version that is not impatience, and it matters. Anxious people nod fast because they are trying to reassure you, to keep you comfortable, to prove they are following. In that case, the nodding speeds up when they feel most on the spot, not when they are most bored. The tell is the eyes, which stay engaged in the anxious version and drift in the impatient one. Once you can separate the two, you stop reading half your friends as rude. Either way, the response is the same. Stop the sentence early. If they were bored, you just saved the conversation. If they were anxious, you just gave them room. Nothing you were about to say was worth more than that, and both versions of the fast nod are, underneath it all, quietly asking you for exactly the same small mercy in the end. The touch that lasts a beat too long, a hand on the shoulder while making a point, a steadying palm at the back as you go through a door, contact on the forearm that stays a moment after the sentence has ended. Each one is small enough to be deniable, and each one is doing work. Deniability is the point. That is what makes it worth reading. Touch is the fastest status instrument the body has. It travels in one direction far more often than people notice, from senior to junior, from confident to uncertain, from the one setting the terms to the one accepting them. Watch a room for an evening and count who initiates and who receives, and a hierarchy nobody would say out loud draws itself in front of you. The duration is where the meaning sits. A touch that matches the sentence is warmth. A touch that outlasts it is a claim, and the extra beat is the part that cannot be defended if you name it, which is precisely why it lasts that long. Warmth and ownership use exactly the same gesture and differ only in how long it lasts. Not all of it is calculated. Some people have no idea and would be mortified to hear it described this way. But the effect on the receiver is identical regardless of intent, which is why your own discomfort is data even when the person meant nothing by it. Trust the beat rather than the explanation. Notice who in your life touches you like that, and whether you would ever do it back to them. If the answer is no, you have just found out what the relationship actually is, and the touch itself was likely never really about warmth at all, but about who gets to quietly set the terms of the room every single time it happens. The word they repeat without noticing. Everybody has one. Honestly. Obviously. To be fair. Look, at the end of the day, it arrives every few minutes, it does no grammatical work at all, and the person saying it has no idea how often it comes out. Spend an hour with someone and you will hear their word 10 times, and once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it for the rest of your life. Filler words are not empty. They are load-bearing in a way the speaker never intended. Each one is a small piece of armor, and the armor tells you what the person expects to be attacked for. Honestly, and to be honest with you, come from people who worry about being believed. And the more often it appears, the more that worry has shaped them. Obviously and clearly come from people who are afraid of looking slow, and they attach the word to things that are not obvious at all. To be fair, belongs to someone who was raised to referee, usually in a house where somebody had to. Just, used constantly, is a person shrinking their own requests before anyone else gets the chance to. Do not confront anyone with this. Naming somebody's verbal tick to their face is unkind, and it makes them self-conscious for a month afterward. Its value is quieter than that, and considerably more useful over the long run. When you know which word a person reaches for, you know what they are guarding, and you can stop stepping on it by accident. Notice which of your own words comes out 10 times an hour. That one is guarding something too, and you have almost certainly never asked yourself what, which is exactly why it has been able to keep doing its quiet job for so many years without ever once being caught out. Most people go their whole lives without hearing their own filler words spoken back to them, which is precisely how it manages to stay invisible for so long. When they switch from I to we, listen to anybody describing something that went well and something that went badly in the same conversation. The pronouns move. I closed the deal. We had some problems with delivery. I made the call. We got the timing wrong. Nothing in the sentence announces the switch, and the person making it would swear they were speaking plainly the whole time. Pronouns are where responsibility gets distributed, and the distribution happens faster than thought. Nobody ever plans it, and almost nobody actually hears themselves doing it in the moment. The general underlying pattern here is simple enough, once named, to become genuinely useful. I collects credit, we spreads blame, and they removes the speaker from the scene entirely. Somebody who says, we lost the client is either being generous or being careful, and which one it is becomes obvious the moment something goes right, and the we disappears. The opposite is worth just as much attention. A person who says we, when the win was clearly theirs alone, is doing something rarer and more expensive, and they usually do not notice they are doing it either. There is a third version that appears in couples and in families. When someone talks about their partner and never says we about anything except obligations, when it is always we should visit your mother and always I want to move house, you are hearing a map of who has decided what. Do not ever challenge the pronouns out loud, since naming the pattern directly tends to make people defensive rather than honest. Just track them across a few conversations and watch which side of the line each kind of news falls on. You will learn what a person is willing to be responsible for, and you will learn it long before any situation forces them to prove it, simply by listening to which failures get a we and which small wins are somehow always carried alone. The switch is worth listening for across an entire year rather than a single conversation, since a person under a single bad week can slip momentarily into either direction without it meaning anything lasting. The detail nobody asked for. You ask where somebody was, and the answer arrives with luggage. Not just the place, but the road they took, the reason they took it, who suggested it, what the traffic was like, and how all of it was really because of a thing that happened last Tuesday. Nothing in the question required any of that. The answer went long anyway, and the extra weight of it stays in the room after the subject has moved on. Unrequested detail is a person building a case. Nobody assembles a case unless some part of them is already expecting a trial. When somebody feels entirely comfortable, answers are short, because a comfortable person assumes they will be believed and does not think about it any further. When somebody feels they might not be believed, they add supports, and each support is a small piece of evidence offered in advance of an accusation nobody has made. This is not remotely the same as lying, and treating it as proof of anything will quietly cost you people you genuinely cannot afford to lose. Anxious people over-explain constantly and reflexively, and so do people who were raised by someone who cross-examined them relentlessly as children. For them, the extra detail is a reflex left over from a house where short answers were dangerous. What the detail always tells you, honest or otherwise, is that the subject carries weight. Something about this question is not neutral for them. That is genuinely useful, and it is all you actually know. The move is to stop treating length as guilt and start treating it as temperature. Note which subjects run long, and notice that the person has no idea they are running, since the extra detail arrives on its own well before any conscious decision to add it. It is worth remembering that some people were simply raised to narrate everything in full, out of habit rather than anxiety, and for them, the length carries no weight at all. How they talk about their last job. Ask anyone why they left the place they worked before this one. The answer takes about 90 seconds, and it is one of the most informative 90 seconds you will ever be given, because the person believes they are describing a company and they are actually describing themselves. There are only a few shapes the answer comes in. Some describe a situation. The role changed, the funding went, the commute became impossible. Some describe a villain. There was a manager, and the manager was impossible, and everyone agreed. Some describe a decision they made, including the part where it did not entirely work. And a few describe nothing at all, offering a smooth phrase that closes the subject without opening anything. Every single version is honest, entirely honest, as far as the speaker themselves is genuinely concerned. Each of them would pass a lie detector without the slightest difficulty, because none of them is a lie. What differs is where they place themselves inside their own history. The villain version is the one to sit with, and not because it is false. It very often is not. The question is whether the villain is singular. One bad manager in a career is arithmetic. A villain in every job going back 15 years is a pattern, and you are being told, in complete good faith, that this person has never once been part of the problem. That is the read, and it is the same read whether the subject is jobs, cities, or former partners. Ask the question early. Listen for the shape rather than the content. Then wait to see whether the same shape turns up when they describe something you were actually present for and already know the truth of, since that is where the story finally has to meet the facts. Very few people ever notice they are being tested this way, which is exactly what makes the test worth running quietly, more than once. The apology that blames you. I am sorry you feel that way. I am sorry if anyone was offended. I am sorry, but you have to understand how it looked from where I was standing. Each one contains the word. Each one arrives in the tone of an apology, and none of them apologizes for anything. The word did no work. You walk away holding something heavier than you came in with, and it takes a day to work out that you were somehow the one who ended up doing the apologizing. A real apology has 3 simple parts, and every one of them is easy enough to check for. It names the thing done. It does not explain why the thing was reasonable, and it does not move on to what you did. Anything with a but in the middle has converted itself into a defense, and the sorry at the front was the anesthetic. The version aimed at your feelings rather than at the action is the most common and the most slippery. It grants that you have an emotional state, which was never in dispute, while quietly declining to grant that anything caused it. What is happening underneath is usually not cruelty. Most people who apologize like this cannot hold the idea that they did harm without concluding they are a bad person, and the conditional wording is the only way they can get near the subject at all. Understanding that is worth something real, because it stops you demanding a sentence from them that they are simply not able to produce. Notice how you feel afterward. A real apology leaves the room lighter. If you are the one carrying the weight out, whatever that was, it was not an apology. No matter how many times the word itself was actually said out loud in the room. The tell is always what happens in the silence right after the sentence ends, whether it feels like a closed door or an opened one. The certainty, they never qualify. Some people speak in weather forecasts, and some speak in verdicts. Listen for the small hedges that most speech contains. I think. Probably. As far as I know. My sense is, they are so ordinary that you stop hearing them, until you meet somebody whose sentences have none at all. Everything arrives as fact. The market is going to turn. She was never serious about him. That restaurant is terrible. Certainty is persuasive, which is why the habit gets rewarded and so rarely examined. Rooms tend to hand authority, almost automatically, to whoever sounds least troubled by any visible doubt. The absence of hedging usually means one of two things, and they look identical from outside. Either the person genuinely knows, in which case the certainty is earned and will hold up when you check it, or the person has learned that confident delivery ends arguments faster than accurate delivery does. The second kind is far more common, and the giveaway is not the tone, but the range. Somebody who is certain about their own field and carefully hedged everywhere else is, generally speaking, trustworthy. Somebody equally certain about interest rates, your marriage, and the exact cause of your headache is not actually telling you what they know. They are telling you how they were taught to speak. There is a cost to being near this that nobody names. Around a person who never qualifies anything, you begin to qualify more, because the only way two people can share a room is if one of them agrees to hold the uncertainty. Watch whether your own speech changes shape in their company. If it does, you have learned something about them, and rather more about the arrangement between you, since the shrinking is a small daily cost you have been quietly paying without ever naming the bill. Somebody who never needs to be certain about anything is, in its own way, one of the rarer and more restful kinds of company available. The question answered with a question. You ask where they were on Thursday and get back, "Why do you want to know?" You ask if they read the message and get, "Why is something wrong?" The reply sounds like engagement. It arrives quickly, it uses your own subject, and it leaves you explaining yourself to somebody who has not yet answered anything at all. Bouncing a question back does three separate things at once, which is exactly why it is such an efficient move and why almost nobody ever notices it happening. It buys time, it shifts the burden onto you, and it converts a request for information into a negotiation about whether the request was reasonable in the first place. 2 seconds later, you are defending your right to have asked, and the original question has quietly left the room. It does not come back on its own, and most people never carry it back. Not every return question is a dodge, and this matters. Curious people ask them constantly because they genuinely want to know what you are after, so they can answer the real question rather than the surface one. The difference is what follows. A curious person asks, listens to your reason, and then answers. A deflector asks, receives your reason, and moves on to something else entirely. The test costs you almost nothing to run. Answer their question honestly and briefly, then return to yours in exactly the same words you used the first time. Most people answer at that point, slightly embarrassed. Somebody who bounces it a second time is telling you the answer exists and is not coming, which is itself an answer, and usually a clearer one than anything they would have said if you had simply let the deflection stand the first time. The test rarely needs repeating more than once, since either the honest answer arrives or the pattern confirms itself immediately. How they describe people not present. Somebody sits across from you and gives you a portrait of a person you have never met. Their colleague, their sister, their ex. You take the portrait at face value because you have nothing to compare it with, and the whole time you have been reading a self-portrait without knowing it. What a person notices in others is a list of what they are watching for. The list was written by whatever they had to survive. The one who describes everyone by status is running a ladder in their head at all times. The one who describes everyone by warmth or coldness is measuring safety. Somebody whose descriptions are nearly all about who was unfair to whom has spent a long time. Somewhere fairness was scarce. None of this is ever chosen deliberately, and none of it is visible at all from the inside. Ask them what they notice about people, and they will describe the people themselves, not the actual noticing underneath it. There is a harder version, and it is the one worth acting on. Watch how somebody describes people who cannot answer back. Not enemies, where heat is understandable, but ordinary absent people. Whether the absent get the benefit of the doubt is the single best predictor of how you will be described when you are the one who is not there, and it costs you nothing at all to observe. The kind, generous reading matters here too, and deserves just as much weight as the harder one. Somebody generous about people who are not present is often generous because they were badly described by someone once, and they have decided to break the pattern. Either way, you are not hearing about a colleague. You are hearing the rules of the room you have just walked into. Rules that were written long before you arrived, and that will quietly apply to you the moment you leave it too. It is worth remembering this the next time you catch yourself describing somebody who happens to be absent from the conversation. The story that changes on retelling. The argument, the deal, the night it all went wrong, gets told to you once, in full, with a particular shape to it. Weeks later they tell it again, and something has moved. A sentence that used to be theirs now belongs to somebody else. A detail that made them look careless has quietly gone. The shape is the same, the ending is the same, and the person is not lying, which is the part that takes some getting used to. Memory is not a recording. It is closer to a story told from notes that get edited each time they are read. Every time a story is retold, it gets rebuilt, and the rebuild uses the materials available now, including how the person currently feels about everyone in it. Details that no longer fit the feeling become harder to reach. Details that support it get sharper. The story drifts toward the version that lets the teller live comfortably with themselves, and it does this quietly, over months, with no moment of decision anywhere in it. This is precisely why memory arguments between couples are so reliably unwinnable for absolutely everyone involved. Both people are honestly reporting a story that has been drifting for years in opposite directions, and neither has access to the original. Insisting on the facts turns a difficult conversation into a hopeless one. What you can do is note the direction of the drift, because the direction is the real information. If every retelling moves the same person further into the wrong, you are watching a case being built, slowly and sincerely, by somebody who believes they are simply remembering. And if your own stories drift, they are building something too, quietly, without your permission. And nobody close enough to notice is ever going to point it out to you. The kindest thing you can do for your own memory is to write the true version down once, early, before the drift has any chance to begin. What they call their own anger. Frustrated, a bit annoyed, stressed. Fine. Somebody is visibly furious, everything in the room can feel it, and the word they reach for is one that would fit a delayed train. Or the reverse, where a minor irritation gets called rage, and the room is asked to treat it as an event. Either way, the gap between the temperature and the word is the interesting part. The words people have for their own anger were issued to them, usually in childhood, and the supply was not equal. In some houses, anger belonged to one person and was forbidden to everyone else, so the children grew up with frustrated and disappointed and nothing stronger. In others, there was no vocabulary at all, only volume. And the adult version has full sentences for every feeling except this one. Nobody chooses this. It arrives already installed. By the time anyone is old enough to question it, it has been in use for decades. Somebody who cannot name their anger cannot easily aim it either, which is why it comes out sideways. As lateness, as a joke with a hook in it, as a silence you are supposed to interpret. It has nowhere legitimate to go, so it uses whichever exits are available. Reading this changes what you do in an argument. Stop responding to the word they used and respond to the temperature you can feel. And notice the word you use for your own. If everything in you is at boiling point and what comes out of your mouth is that you are a bit tired, somebody handed you that word a long time ago, and you have been quietly making do with it ever since, without ever once asking whether it actually fits what you feel. Learning even one sharper word for your own anger tends to change how quickly it clears, simply because it finally has somewhere accurate to go. The joke that carries a real message. It lands in the middle of something pleasant. A remark about how you never answer your phone, delivered with a laugh in company, with the timing of an actual joke. Everyone smiles. You smile. And underneath the smiling something arrives that is not funny at all and has nowhere to go. Because objecting to it would make you the person who cannot take a joke. Humor is the standard delivery system for things a person is not willing to say directly. It is the only format that lets you send and deny in the same breath. The joke does the work, and the format supplies the escape route. If the message is received, the point has been made. If you push back, it was only a joke and you have overreacted, and the conversation about your reaction replaces the conversation about the message. The move costs nothing, and it is available to everyone, which is why almost everyone uses it at some point, mostly without any plan at all. The tell is repetition. A one-off joke about your driving is a joke about your driving. The same joke, at 3 different dinners, in front of 3 different audiences, is a position that has found a way to be stated without ever being defended. The laugh at the end is what keeps it out of reach. When you catch the pattern, the useful response is not to object in company. It is to raise the subject later, on its own, without the audience, and without mentioning the joke at all. Whatever is under there is usually real, and often smaller than the number of times it has been said would suggest, which is itself a small mercy once you finally get to hear it said plainly, without the laugh attached to soften it. The relief afterward is usually mutual, even if only one of you ever admits to feeling it. How they say no without saying it. Sounds good. Let me check. Maybe. I will see how the week goes. Definitely. At some point. Each one is technically a yes, each one is delivered warmly, and none of them will ever become a plan. You put it in the calendar of your mind anyway, and 3 weeks later you are mildly hurt about something the other person never actually agreed to. Soft refusal exists because direct refusal is socially expensive, and most people were never taught how to pay it. The bill arrives immediately and in person. Saying no requires you to accept that somebody will be disappointed in front of you, and a great many otherwise brave people will do almost anything to avoid that particular moment. So they produce a shape that sounds like agreement, buys the pleasant ending, and quietly relies on the plan dying of natural causes. The grammar is consistent enough to be read. Once you see it, you will never again mistake one for the other. A real yes attaches itself to a time. Tuesday, after the holidays. I will message you tonight. A soft no attaches itself to conditions nobody controls, or to no time at all. Once you can hear the difference, most of your calendar disappointments simply stop happening. Nobody deceived you. You took a polite noise as a commitment. The kind response is to make the no cheap for them. Offer a specific time and add that another week is completely fine. You will get either a real plan or a real no within a day. And either one is worth more than the pleasant version you have been collecting for years and quietly mistaking for a calendar full of things that were never actually going to happen. The specific time you offer does most of the work here, since it removes the only exit a soft answer ever really needed. The phrase they use to end things, everyone has a closing move. Anyway, so yeah, it is what it is. We will see. It arrives when a subject has become uncomfortable, it is delivered lightly, and it is the verbal equivalent of a hand placed on a door. Once you know a person's phrase, you know the precise moment they decided the conversation was over, and you know it several seconds before they say anything that actually sounds like an ending. The phrase does one job. It ends something without anybody being seen to end it. It closes a subject without anybody having to say that the subject is being closed, which lets both people leave with their dignity and lets the conversation appear to have finished on its own. That is a genuinely useful piece of social machinery, and it is not a bad thing. Almost every functional friendship depends on both people being allowed to stop somewhere. What it tells you is where the edges are. Every person has a perimeter, and almost nobody could draw their own. Track where the phrase lands across a few months. If anyway, always turns up when money is mentioned, or when a particular name comes up, or whenever the conversation gets near what they actually want from their life, you have mapped the perimeter of somebody's comfort without asking a single direct question. Do not push through it in the moment. The phrase is a request, and honoring it is what earns you the right to come back later. But note where it fell. The subjects a person keeps closing are rarely the ones they care least about. Usually they are the opposite, the ones sitting closest to something they have not yet found a safer way to open on their own terms. Patience with the phrase, rather than pressure against it, is usually what eventually earns you the fuller version. What they do with your good news. You got the job. The offer came through. The thing you have been quietly working on for 2 years finally happened, and you have chosen this person to tell first. Watch the first 4 seconds. Not the words, which almost everyone gets right, but what happens to their face before the words arrive, and what the sentence after the congratulations is actually about. There are 4 ways good news gets received, and only one of them builds anything. Somebody can take it and enlarge it, asking questions, wanting the details, keeping you inside the moment you earned. Somebody can take it and shrink it, saying that is nice and moving on. Somebody can take it and correct it, mentioning the salary, the commute, the risk, all of it framed as looking out for you. And somebody can take it and turn it, so that within a minute you are listening about their own job, their own offer, their own year, Only the first one costs anything. Enlarging somebody else's good news requires you to stand in a moment that is not about you and stay there without needing anything back, and plenty of people who love you genuinely cannot do it. Envy is not usually the reason. More often, good news makes them measure their own life, and the measuring hurts, so they move. The read is worth having because it is stable. People respond to good news the same way every time, and you have been giving them chances to show you for years. Notice who you actually want to tell first. Your own instinct worked this out long ago and has been quietly editing the list without telling you, moving names up and down based on evidence you never consciously logged. Try naming the person out loud before you check the list, and notice how rarely the two disagree. What they do with your bad news. Something has gone wrong, and you have said it out loud. What comes back arrives in one of a few shapes, and the shape is decided in the first 2 seconds, before anybody has had time to think about being kind. Some people move toward it. They stay in the difficulty instead of managing it. Some people start solving. Some people go quiet and change the subject as soon as it is decently possible. And some people find, within a sentence or two, a way to be the person who is really having the hard time here. Solving is the one that gets misread most often. When somebody responds to your bad news with a plan, it looks like a failure of warmth, and it almost never is. For a great many people, especially those raised to be useful, a plan is the only shape their care knows how to take, and being told to just listen leaves them genuinely stranded. The one to watch is the retreat, not the person who does the wrong thing, but the one who does nothing, whose message arrives 2 days later, whose interest in your life resumes precisely when it becomes pleasant again. That is not cruelty either. Most of them are simply overwhelmed by other people's difficulty and have never learned to sit inside it. But the effect on you is identical regardless of what caused it. Note who you tell the second time. After bad news, most people quietly reorganize their list without ever announcing it, and if somebody has slipped down yours, you already know what they did. You have simply not said it to yourself yet, though the reorganizing itself has already been quietly finished for some time. The list rarely announces its own updates, which is exactly why it can be trusted more than the version you would describe out loud. How they behave when you are ill. Illness strips a relationship down to its frame. You are less interesting, less useful, less able to hold up your half of anything, and whatever is left over is the actual relationship rather than the enjoyable version of it. A week in bed will tell you more than a year of dinners. Nothing about you is doing any of the work in that week, so whatever appears was already there. Watch what the care is organized around. Some people show up and ask what you need. Some people show up and perform the caring, arranging things in a way that requires you to be grateful on a schedule, so that by the third day, you are managing their feelings about your illness on top of the illness. Some become oddly irritated, and underneath the irritation is fear, because your being unwell has made something feel unsafe that they did not know depended on you. And some simply go quiet until you are better. There is a particular version worth naming because it confuses people for years. Somebody who is wonderful in a crisis and absent in a long illness is not a fraud. Crisis is dramatic and finite, and it rewards the people who are good at rising. Ordinary chronic difficulty rewards nobody and asks for something much duller, which is turning up on a Tuesday when nothing at all is happening. Very different people are good at each. You do not have to grade anyone on this. But notice who was there in week 3, because week 1 proves almost nothing. And week 3 is where the truth about a person's staying power actually gets written down, quietly, in a ledger nobody else can see, kept faithfully whether or not either of you ever reads it back. The same read applies in reverse, to what you offer somebody else once the interesting part of caring for them has clearly passed. Whether they defend you in a room, somebody says something about you while you are not there, a joke, a small correction, an opinion delivered as though it were common knowledge. Whoever else is in that room now has 3 seconds to decide what to do, and you will never hear about it either way. The whole thing costs you nothing and reveals almost everything. Defending an absent person is genuinely expensive. It means introducing friction into a comfortable room, disagreeing with somebody present in favor of somebody who is not, and accepting the small social cost that follows. Silence, on the other hand, costs absolutely nothing at all. It also leaves no trace, which is the other half of its appeal. This is why silence is the standard response, and why the exceptions matter as much as they do. What makes it complicated is that most people who stay silent are not disloyal. They are conflict-averse, or junior, or simply slow. And later they will feel bad about it in private and say nothing to you. That is worth understanding, because it stops you dividing everyone into loyal and treacherous over a moment they barely registered. The read that matters is a pattern rather than an incident. You will find out eventually, through the way things drift back to you. Somebody who has defended you once will do it again, and the effect on your standing when you are not in the room compounds quietly across years. There is one direction of this you can actually control. Notice what you do in the 3 seconds after somebody criticizes a person who is not present. Whatever you do there is what you are asking others to do for you, since the standard you hold in that room is the exact standard you are implicitly requesting for yourself when your own name eventually comes up in a room you are not in. The favor that comes with interest. Help arrives when you need it, real and useful, and you are genuinely grateful for it. Then, weeks later, it comes up, lightly, in passing, in a context where it does not belong. And then again, a month after that. The favor has not finished being given. It has become a small, permanent object in the relationship, picked up whenever leverage is needed. Real generosity ends when the giving ends. It does not accrue anything, and it does not get looked up later. A gift that keeps being mentioned was never entirely a gift. It was a purchase, and what it bought was standing. The tell is not the reminder itself, because people mention things by accident all the time. The tell is where the reminder lands. If it turns up in the middle of a disagreement, or just before a request, or in front of an audience who did not know, the favor is doing work that has nothing to do with kindness. Most people who do this are not calculating. They are usually people who feel they have very little to offer, and have discovered that a favor, held onto, is one of the few forms of security available to them. Knowing that makes it easier to handle without becoming cold about it. The behavior is still yours to decline. There is a clean response. Discharge the debt in a form of your choosing, promptly, and do it before it can be invoked. Not with something equivalent, which starts an accounting war, but with something clearly ended. The relationship afterward is either fine, in which case it always was, or noticeably flatter. And the flatness is your answer regardless of anything either of you says out loud about it. A single clean settling almost always says more than a dozen warm words ever could. How they handle being wrong with you. It has become clear that they were mistaken about something. Not something enormous. The date, the arrangement, who said what. What happens in the next 10 seconds is one of the most stable predictors of what living alongside this person will be like for the next 10 years. There are only a few available moves. You have probably already guessed which one you are going to get. Some people say they were wrong, and the subject closes. Some people were technically right for a reason that was not in play at the time. Some accept it, while making the acceptance so heavy that you spend the rest of the evening reassuring them they are not a terrible person. And some move immediately to something you did, so that within a minute, you are the one explaining yourself and nobody remembers how this started. What sits underneath is how much of the person's self depends on not being wrong. If being mistaken about a train time feels like a threat to who they are, no ordinary conversation can be allowed to end with them mistaken, and every disagreement will therefore run longer than it should. That is not malice, it is architecture, and it was built long before you arrived. You are simply the person standing in the building. The practical value here is knowing what to stop trying. Around somebody who cannot be wrong, being right is not a strategy. Note which of the 4 moves you get, and note which one you make yourself when the mistake is yours. That second one is more useful, because it is the only one you can change, and changing it is usually the single fastest way to shorten every disagreement that follows for the rest of your life. Nothing else on this list moves the outcome quite as reliably. What happens when you ask for time? Not help, not money, not advice. Just time, the plain kind, an hour on a Thursday for no particular reason. This is the cheapest thing a person can give and the hardest one to fake, which is why it is the most honest currency in any relationship. Money can be sent without attention. An hour cannot. Watch what returns. There is a version where a time gets offered back immediately, even if it is 3 weeks out, and the specificity is the message. There is a version where the answer is warm and permanently vague. And there is a version where the answer depends on whether something better fails to materialize. None of it is ever stated. Nobody has ever declined a friendship out loud. All of it is visible after 2 or 3 attempts, and most people never run the second attempt because the first vague answer felt kind enough to accept. Be careful with the arithmetic. Some people are genuinely buried, in a way that has nothing to do with you, and periods like that come and go across a life. A read taken during somebody's worst year is not a read on the person. What you are looking for is the shape across seasons, not the answer in a hard month. 1 year is the minimum honest sample. There is a harder version of this worth sitting with. Look at where your own time actually goes rather than where you say your priorities are. Time is the one thing nobody can pretend about for long. And the calendar of the past month is an honest document about everyone in your life, including you. Whether or not either of you would actually enjoy sitting down and reading it plainly out loud together. Few habits reveal more about a life, quietly, than an honest look at where the hours actually went. Whether they remember what you said. You mentioned the appointment, the difficult conversation coming up, the name of the person who has been making your work miserable. Weeks later, somebody asks how it went, using the right name without being reminded. Somebody else asks you the same opening question they have been asking for 2 years. Memory of this kind is not really about intelligence, and it is not entirely about affection either. It is about where attention was pointed at the time. Storage is downstream of attention, and attention is a choice made without noticing. Detail gets stored when a person is genuinely inside the conversation rather than waiting inside it, and no amount of goodwill afterward can retrieve something that was never taken in. This is why the ones who remember are so noticeable. They are rare, and what they are demonstrating is not a good memory, but a habit of presence. The memory is a symptom. The unkind reading is available and mostly wrong. Plenty of people who adore you have terrible recall, particularly under stress, and some have spent their whole lives apologizing for it. There is a useful distinction. Somebody who forgets the details but remembers the shape, who knows something hard is happening even if the specifics have gone, was present. Somebody who has retained nothing at all was elsewhere. What you can do with this is stop testing people silently and then quietly marking them down, which is a game nobody knows they are playing. And notice whose details you retain without effort. That list is not the same as the list of people you would say you are closest to, and the difference is worth sitting with quietly, rather than explaining away too quickly for the sake of comfort. Presence, it turns out, leaves a more durable trace in memory than affection alone ever quite manages to. How they treat your other people. Everyone can be pleasant to the person they are trying to keep. The interesting part is, what happens around the people attached to you? The old friend, the difficult sibling, the child, the colleague you talk about too much. That is where the cost sits. Because being warm to somebody you have no personal use for is unpaid work. Nobody is watching, and nobody will thank them for it. Watch for one specific thing, rather than general politeness. Does this person try to give you more of your own people, or quietly less? It shows up in small choices that never get discussed. Not one of them would survive being described out loud. Whether your friend gets invited, whether the visit gets scheduled or keeps slipping, whether the stories about your sister slowly acquire a tone. Nothing is ever said against anyone, and yet, after 2 years, the shape of your life is narrower than it was, and you would struggle to point at the moment it happened. There is an entirely innocent version, and it is common. Some people are shy or exhausted, or genuinely find your friend hard work, and they are not trying to remove anybody at all. The difference is what they do when you name it. Somebody with no agenda hears it and makes an effort, sometimes badly. Somebody with an agenda explains, warmly and at length, why the person in question is the real problem. Count the people you see now against the people you saw 3 years ago. If the number has fallen, do not assume the answer is here. But ask the question because nobody else is going to ask it for you, and the narrowing itself will not announce its own cause when it finally gets noticed, years after it actually began, quietly, one small decision at a time. The effort that quietly stopped. Nothing happened. There was no argument and no conversation. But somewhere in the past year, the messages got shorter. The plans stopped being suggested by them, and you became the one who reaches first every single time. If you had to name the week it changed, you could not, which is precisely why it went unaddressed for so long. Relationships almost never end at a moment. The moment is what people report afterward, because a story needs one. They end through a slow withdrawal of small efforts, each one too minor to raise without sounding needy. And the smallness is exactly what makes the process so effective. Nobody can be confronted about a text that got 2 words shorter. There is nothing to point at. So, the drift continues. Both people register it, and neither says anything, because saying something would make it real. The useful measure is initiation, not warmth. Initiation costs something, and warmth does not. Warmth is easy to maintain long after interest has gone, and plenty of people are perfectly pleasant to somebody they have already left. Who suggests? Who arranges? Who reaches out with nothing to ask for? Count it across a month, and you will have a clearer picture than any conversation would give you. There is a caveat that saves a great deal of grief. Some people never initiate anything with anyone, ever, including people they love and always have. Check whether the change is in the relationship or has simply been that person's whole life. If it is a change, it is information. And it deserves a direct question, asked once, kindly, rather than another 6 months of silently counting messages and drawing your own private conclusions from the tally alone, in the dark, without ever checking them against anything real. Who adjusts when plans? 2 things are happening on the same evening. Somebody has to move. It will not be discussed, and it will not need to be. In any relationship that has run for more than a few months, there is already an answer to who that is, and neither person put it in writing or would necessarily agree that it exists. Flexibility is the quietest form of power there is. Whoever is more able to move is, by definition, the one who moves. Whoever moves less is not usually being selfish about it. More often they have a job with harder edges, or a temperament that finds change expensive, or simply a habit of announcing plans as facts rather than proposals, which does most of the work by itself. The other person adjusts once, then again, and after a year the adjusting has become invisible, part of the furniture, no longer something either of them notices happening. What makes this worth examining is that resentment does not follow the size of the sacrifice. It follows whether the sacrifice was seen. Being unseen is what turns a gift into a debt. People will move their entire schedule for years without complaint, provided somebody occasionally says out loud that they did it. What corrodes is the version where it has stopped registering as anything at all. Add up the last 10 collisions. Not the big ones, which get discussed, but the ordinary Tuesdays. If the score is 9-1, that is not a crisis, and it is not necessarily unfair. But it is a fact that both of you are living inside, and only one of you is currently aware of it, which is its own small and unfair advantage that tends to compound quietly over years without either of you ever sitting down to name it. What they do. When you say no, you decline something. Not dramatically. The smallest possible no, offered without a speech. You cannot make it. You would rather not. You have decided against it. What happens in the next 30 seconds is the most compressed piece of information about a relationship that exists, and you can collect it without any risk at all. There is the version where the no is simply received. Fine, another time, and the conversation continues as though nothing has been spent. There is the version where it is received and then quietly logged, so that a week later you notice a coolness nobody will admit to. There is the version where you are asked for reasons, and then asked about the reasons, until declining costs more than agreeing would have. And there is the version where somebody is hurt, visibly, in a way that requires you to spend the rest of the evening repairing something you did not break. Only the first version leaves your no intact. The other 3 are answering a different question entirely, which is who decides. The others do not overrule it, they simply make it expensive, and expensive refusals stop happening after a while. That is the mechanism, and mostly nobody involved has planned any of it. What you are measuring is whether this person can tolerate not getting their way from you specifically. Somebody who can is safe to be honest with. And honesty is the whole basis of everything that comes afterward. Somebody who cannot has arranged things so that you will eventually stop saying no. Count how many times you have declined anything recently. If the answer is none, you already know. And the knowing arrived quietly, long before you ever thought to count, settling in without asking permission and without needing a single number to confirm it. What they reach for in an argument. Every person has a first instrument, and it comes out within the first 90 seconds of any real disagreement, long before anybody has decided on a strategy. Volume, cold precision, silence, tears, a sudden calm that is more frightening than shouting. The subject changes every time, and the instrument almost never does. What you are watching is not a choice. It is whatever worked in the house they grew up in, refined over 20 years, and then carried into every room since. If shouting ended arguments there, shouting is the instrument. If going quiet made the other person come looking, silence is. If being reasonable while somebody else lost control was the only way to win, then reason itself has been weaponized, and it will feel maddening to argue against because it looks exactly like fairness. Knowing the instrument changes what you do with it. Most of the damage in ordinary conflict comes from responding to the instrument rather than the subject. You answer the volume with volume, the silence with silence, the cold logic with your own. And 40 minutes later, neither of you can remember what started it. The instrument was never the argument. It is what gets used when the argument becomes frightening, and it works by making the other person respond to it instead. Name your own before you need it. Everybody has one, including you. And it is the hardest thing on this list to see from the inside, because it does not feel like a tactic at all. It feels like the only reasonable response to what the other person has just done. That feeling is precisely how you know you have found it, since the instrument always disguises itself as the only sane response available in the room, right up until you finally learn to name it while it is still happening. Who they become when they are tired. Somewhere around the 11th hour of a long day, a second version of a person arrives, slightly shorter with everyone, less able to let small things pass, more likely to say the sentence they have been not saying for weeks. You have met this version before, and you know exactly which one it is. The polite explanation is that tiredness makes people worse, and that is true, but it is not the whole of it. What exhaustion actually removes is management. Everybody runs a small ongoing operation to stay pleasant, to filter, to convert what they feel into something acceptable, and that operation costs energy. When the energy runs out, the filter goes first, and what is underneath comes through unedited. So the tired version is not a distortion of the person. It is the person with the staff sent home. Nothing new arrived. Something old simply stopped being covered. This is worth being careful with in both directions. What comes out when somebody is exhausted is real, but it is not the whole truth about them either, because everyone is uglier without resources, and holding somebody's worst hour against their best self is its own kind of unfairness. What it is honest about is content rather than proportion. The complaint that surfaces at midnight is usually a real complaint, even if the size of it is wrong. Notice which subject arrives when a person has nothing left. That is the thing that has been sitting there all along, quietly costing them something to hold. And notice yours, because you have one, and somebody has been listening to it at midnight for years without ever once mentioning what they heard, out of a kindness you have probably never properly thanked them for, in all the ordinary daylight hours between one midnight and the next. The moment they bring up the past, you are discussing something that happened this week. Then, without any announcement, you are discussing something from 4 years ago, and the temperature of the room has changed. The old thing arrives fully formed, with dates, with quotations, with a level of detail that tells you it has been kept somewhere accessible the entire time. Nothing about it sounds like remembering. It sounds like reading. Bringing up the past mid-argument means one of two things, and they are worth separating. Either the old thing was never resolved and has been waiting, or the present argument is being lost and reinforcements have been called. The first is a genuine unfinished conversation, and it deserves one. The second is a move, and it works, because you now have two arguments running and no way to finish either. Whichever one you answer, you have abandoned the other, and that is the point of it. The detail is the tell. Something genuinely unresolved is remembered vaguely and painfully, in feelings rather than transcripts. Something being used as ammunition is remembered precisely because it has been rehearsed. When you hear the exact words somebody said to you in a kitchen in another decade, you are hearing a file that has been opened many times. The useful response is not to defend the old thing, which is unwinnable. It is to say that it clearly still matters, to offer it a conversation of its own at a different time, and then to return to the present one. Say it once and mean it. Half of the time the offer is declined, which tells you plainly what the old thing was actually being used for, and it was rarely ever about being understood in the first place, no matter how sincerely the offer to talk it through was actually meant. How they behave when they lose. Not a catastrophe. An ordinary loss. The game, the argument, the job that went to somebody else, the decision that went the other way. Whatever happens in the 20 minutes afterward is one of the least guarded things a person ever does, because losing removes the energy required to perform. Nobody is at their most constructed in the 20 minutes after they were beaten. Watch where the loss goes. Some people put it into the thing itself, and they are frustrated for an hour and then finished with it. Some put it into the process, and the referee was blind. The interview was a formality. The whole thing was decided before anyone walked into the room. Some put it into themselves in a way that requires the room to talk them out of it, so that within a few minutes, everyone present is working on their feelings rather than their own. And a few simply congratulate whoever won and mean it, which is far rarer than anyone admits. There is no moral scoring available here, and pretending otherwise is the error. Graceful losers are not better people. They are frequently people who were never taught that losing mattered. Somebody who takes a loss badly is often somebody who cared, and caring is not a defect. The information is not in the intensity, but in the direction. If the loss never once lands anywhere near their own decisions, across many losses and many years, you are looking at a person for whom nothing can ever be their own doing. And that has consequences you will eventually meet. The consequences usually arrive described as somebody else's fault as well, in a pattern that repeats until somebody finally names it out loud, gently, without turning the naming into another argument entirely. Watch where you put yours. The threat they never quite make. Maybe I should just go and stay at my sister's for a while. I do not know how much longer I can do this. Perhaps you would be happier with somebody else. It arrives in the middle of a difficult conversation. It is delivered quietly, and it is never a threat. Because if you name it as one, you will be told you are being dramatic. What it does is change the subject completely. 2 seconds ago you were discussing something specific and now you are reassuring somebody that the relationship is not ending, which is a much larger question and one you did not raise. Whatever you were saying is finished. It will not come back tonight. It will not come back next week either, because raising it again would look like you were the one who could not let go. Most people who do this are not manipulating anybody in the way that word suggests. Very often they genuinely feel it, in the moment, at full strength, and by morning, it has passed entirely while you are still carrying it. That is the part that makes it so exhausting to live beside. The words cost them almost nothing and cost you a night. What matters is frequency. Said once, in a bad hour, it is a person overwhelmed. Said regularly, whenever a conversation becomes uncomfortable, it has become a mechanism, whether or not anybody chose it. The response that helps is not reassurance and not confrontation. It is to say that you take it seriously and want to talk about it properly tomorrow, and then to actually do that. Anything genuine survives until tomorrow, and the sentences that quietly evaporate by morning were never really about the relationship ending at all, only about a feeling that briefly needed somewhere large to go. How fast they reach. Always and never. You always do this. You never listen. Every single time. The words arrive early in a disagreement, and they arrive fast, and the moment they land, the argument stops being about the thing that happened and becomes about whether the accusation is fair. Which it never entirely is, because nobody always does anything. So the first thing you feel is the unfairness of the word, and the first thing you say is about the word, and the real subject is already lost. Absolute language is not really a claim about frequency. It is a measure of how long something has been going on without being said. Nobody reaches for always about a first offense. The word appears when a person has been counting privately for months, has said nothing each time, and has finally arrived at a moment where all of it comes out compressed into a single sentence. So, the exaggeration is not dishonesty. It is a summary of everything that never got its own conversation. Understanding that changes the response entirely. Arguing with the word is technically correct and completely useless. You can prove that you did listen on Tuesday, and you will win the point and lose everything underneath it, because the point was never Tuesday. What is being told to you is that this has happened often enough to become a category. Ask when else, not as a challenge, as a genuine question, in a normal voice. Ask it genuinely, and be prepared for a list, because there will be one. And notice when always shows up in your own mouth. It means you have been keeping score somewhere without telling anybody, including yourself. And the score has been running for considerably longer than you would guess, tallied silently through every small moment you told yourself did not matter enough to mention. What they do when you cry. Crying removes every social instruction a person has. There is no correct script, nothing to say that reliably helps, and no way to be pleasant through it. So whatever happens next is close to unfiltered. And it is one of the few moments in adult life where you get to see somebody's actual capacity rather than their manners. The performance stops because there is nothing available to perform. There are a handful of responses, and they do not divide into good and bad as neatly as people expect. Some come closer. Some start fixing, urgently, because the crying has to stop and a solution is the fastest route available. Some become still and quiet and simply remain in the room. Some leave, either physically or by producing a reason the crying is unwarranted. And some become irritated, which is almost always fear wearing a different coat. The irritation is not with you. It is with being made to feel powerless in front of somebody. The read here is not warmth. It is tolerance for helplessness. A person who cannot be near somebody they are unable to help will always leave in some fashion, and this says far more about what they can bear than about how much they care. Plenty of people who love you enormously cannot sit inside another person's distress for 90 seconds. That is a limit rather than a verdict about their love. Notice who stayed. Not who said the right thing, because almost nobody does, but who was still there when it finished. That is a short list in most lives, and it is the list that matters when something genuinely bad eventually happens, far more than the longer, more crowded list of people who were only ever reliably there for the easy parts. Who they blame. When no one is at fault, the train is cancelled, the weather has ruined the day, the restaurant lost the booking, nobody in the room did anything. And yet, within a minute somebody has located a culprit, and often the culprit is standing right beside them. This is the cleanest test that exists, because there is no real fault available, so whatever gets assigned came entirely from inside the person. There was nothing outside to take it, so it had to come from somewhere else. Bad luck is genuinely difficult to hold. Randomness offers nothing to do, nowhere to put the feeling, and no story with a shape. Blame converts an unbearable nothing into a manageable something, and the conversion happens fast, below the level of thought. A culprit gives the feeling somewhere to go and gives the day a shape it did not have. So the person is not being cruel. They are relieving a pressure they may not even have noticed building. What matters is the address. Some people blame the situation, and it ends there. Some blame themselves, immediately and disproportionately, and spend the afternoon apologizing for the weather. Some blame whoever is nearest, and if that is repeatedly you, you are functioning as a lightning rod for a feeling that has nothing to do with you. That arrangement can run for years without either person ever naming it. One of you has been absorbing weather, and neither of you would describe it that way. You will not fix this by defending yourself in the moment, because the moment is not about facts. Notice the pattern across several unlucky days. And notice where your own goes, because everybody sends it somewhere. And the sending happens far too quickly to ever feel like a conscious, deliberate choice in the moment. The exit. They take mid-argument. There is a point in a difficult conversation where somebody leaves without leaving the room. Their body stays where it is, and everything else goes. The phone comes out. The subject changes to something practical. They go to make tea, and the tea takes 11 minutes. They agree with you suddenly and completely, in a way that ends the conversation without resolving any part of it. Every exit is a request for the intensity to stop, and each one is a different kind of request. None of them will be phrased as a request, because phrasing it would require staying. The T is usually genuine overwhelm, a nervous system that has hit its limit and needs 90 seconds to come back down. The sudden agreement is usually surrender rather than agreement, and it should worry you more than continued disagreement would, because the subject has not gone anywhere. It has simply gone quiet. The phone is the coldest of them, because it says that whatever is happening here is now optional. What ruins couples is not the exit itself, but the response to it. When one person leaves and the other follows, raising the volume to get them back into the room, the exit next time will come earlier and go further. Let it happen and set a time. Say it out loud so that it is an agreement rather than an escape. 20 minutes, then we finish this. The number matters more than the length. Almost everybody can come back to a hard conversation if they are certain they are allowed to step out of it first, and almost nobody can stay inside one that has no visible end, which is the entire reason the 20 minutes matters more than anything either of you actually manages to say during it. The number itself is almost incidental, as long as both of you actually trust that it will be honored. What money trouble turns them into. Money pressure does something no other kind of stress quite manages. It narrows the field of view. It makes small decisions feel enormous, and it turns ordinary requests into demands. A question about where to eat dinner becomes a question about the whole month. Somebody who has been generous for years becomes strange about a restaurant bill, and neither of you knows what to do with the change. What is happening is not stinginess. Scarcity occupies the mind, continuously and in the background, and it uses the same attention that everything else requires. A person under real financial pressure is running a second process at all times, and there is less of them available for anything, including patience, including you. The change in character is not a character change. It is a resource shortage wearing a character's clothes. Give the resources back and the character returns, usually within weeks. This matters because it is one of the few pressures that reliably gets misread as a revelation. People conclude they have finally seen who somebody really is, when what they have seen is what anybody looks like with a narrowed field of view. The genuine signal is elsewhere. Watch what happens to the shame. That is where the real difference between people lives, and it has nothing to do with how much anybody earns. Some people can say plainly that things are tight. Others cannot, and will construct elaborate reasons to decline things rather than admit the real one. And that inability will cost them far more across a life than the money ever will. And if you are the one constructing reasons, notice how much energy it takes, energy that a single honest sentence, said early and plainly, would have cost you almost nothing at all to spend instead. What they say about you to win. In the middle of an argument, somebody reaches past the subject and picks up something about you. Not what you did, what you are. You are just like your mother. This is exactly why nobody stays. You have always been too much. The sentence is aimed to end the conversation, and it usually does. Everything after it is about the sentence. What makes these lines so effective is that they were not invented in the moment. They were assembled slowly, from things you said in confidence, from things you have admitted to being afraid of, and they are accurate enough to land because the person knows you well. Intimacy is what makes it possible. Nobody who does not know you could reach that particular shelf. The material was handed over in better hours, by you, willingly. The intention is almost never as cold as it feels afterward. Most people who do this are losing, feel it, and reach for whatever ends the loss, and by the following morning they are genuinely appalled at themselves. That does not undo it. The line has been said, and it will be available to both of you for the rest of the relationship. It joins a small collection that neither of you keeps deliberately and neither of you can throw away. What matters is what happens next. Some people come back and take it apart properly, and the relationship survives it. Some apologize for the argument in general and never for the sentence, which leaves it standing. Notice which sentences you have been handed that never got taken back. And notice, harder, which ones you have handed somebody else, in whatever confiding hour once felt safe enough to hand them over, long before either of you knew they would end up used this way. How long they stay, and the argument finishes. What follows is either an hour, an evening, 3 days, or a silence with no announced end date, and the length has almost nothing to do with the size of what happened. The same offense produces an hour in one person and a week in another. Some people cannot hold anger past a meal. Some hold it precisely until an apology arrives, which makes it a transaction. And some hold it until it has done its work, which is a punishment even when nobody involved would ever use that word. What you are watching is how a person was taught that repair happens. In some houses, arguments ended by simply stopping, and the ending was never discussed. In others, the injured party withdrew, and the other one had to earn their way back, sometimes for days. Nobody in either house was told this was the rule. They just grew up knowing what came after conflict, and now they are running it with you. Nobody chose it, and nobody can describe it, which is why it never comes up as a subject. The reason this matters more than the arguing itself is that people can survive almost any amount of conflict if repair is reliable. What breaks them is not knowing when it ends. Uncertainty does the damage that the anger itself never quite manages. A long silence teaches you to avoid the subject that caused it. And after enough of those, there is a list of things you no longer raise. Look at your own list. It is usually longer than you expect, and every item on it was added quietly, without anybody deciding anything, simply because the cost of raising it once turned out to be higher, in the moment, than the quieter cost of simply never raising it again. The version of you they argue with. Somewhere in a serious argument, you notice that you are being accused of an intention you did not have. Not a misunderstanding of what you said, but a whole motive, fully constructed, attributed to you with total confidence. You are being difficult on purpose. You wanted to embarrass me. You did that to prove a point. And you find yourself defending a person who does not exist. You will not win, because the accusation was never about you. Under pressure, people stop arguing with who is in front of them and start arguing with a model. The model was built from earlier experience, usually from somebody else entirely, and it is much faster to reach than actually working out what you meant. Under stress, the mind stops asking and starts retrieving. In the middle of conflict, when everything is expensive, the mind takes the shortcut it already has. This is why the same fight recurs in a relationship with different content each time. The subject is whatever happened this week. The argument is 30 years old. Two people are not repeating an argument. They are each arguing with a figure who was assembled long before they met. Notice the moment the description stops matching you. It is usually earlier than you think. Not in order to win, but because that moment is the exact point where the conversation left the room and went somewhere older. Saying so gently sometimes brings it back. That is not me. 4 words, no accusation, and occasionally it works. And notice the version of them you have built, because you have one, and it is doing the same work in the other direction, arguing with a figure that stopped being entirely them quite some time ago, if it was ever really them to begin with. The question they never ask you. Somebody has known you for 3 years. They know where you work, what you drive, how your weekend went, and it occurs to you one evening that they have never once asked what you actually want, or whether you are happy, or what happened in the years before they met you. Nothing has been withheld from you. Nothing has been refused. There is simply a door in the conversation that has never been opened, and you have been walking past it for so long that you stopped noticing it was there at all. Absent questions are as informative as asked ones, and considerably harder to spot, because nothing happens when a question is not asked. There is no moment to point at. Nothing arrives to be noticed. The reasons vary, and most of them are entirely ordinary. Some people were raised where personal questions were intrusive, and they are being careful rather than cold. Some are afraid of what the answer might require of them, because once you know somebody is unhappy, you have to do something about it. And some never develop the habit at all, and would be genuinely surprised to hear the gap described to them. The read is not about affection. It is about what this person is prepared to know. Somebody who never asks has quietly set a limit on how much of you can enter the relationship, and that limit will hold in both directions, including on the day you need it not to. Notice which question nobody has ever asked you. Then notice which one you have never asked anybody else, and how long you have been avoiding the answer, since the avoidance itself is doing exactly the same quiet, protective work in both directions at once. What they never talk about. Every person has a subject that does not come up. Not a secret exactly, because nothing is being hidden with any real effort. It is simply that after 100 conversations, you realize you know nothing about their father, or their 20s, or the 2 years between the job before last and this one. The subject has been walked around so smoothly that it took you years to notice the shape of the walking. Nobody announces a closed subject. There is no sign on it and no rule stated. What happens instead is a series of very small redirections, so minor that each one passes as ordinary conversational drift. A question gets answered narrowly. A story stops one step earlier than it needs to. An anecdote about that period turns out to be the same anecdote you have heard before, polished and safe, functioning as a lid. You have heard the lid so many times that you mistook it for the room. What is under a closed subject is almost never what people imagine. It is rarely shameful, and it is rarely dramatic. Far more often it is grief that was never put into words, or a version of themselves they have decided not to be anymore, or something ordinary that once went so badly that talking about it costs more than it is worth. The value of noticing is knowing not to walk in casually. A closed subject opened by accident, in company, at a dinner, does damage that takes a long time to repair. And notice which subject you walk around, and how good you have become at it, and how few people have ever caught you doing it, given how many years of quiet practice went into making the walking look like nothing at all worth mentioning. The people you have never met. Somebody talks about their best friend constantly. 2 years in, you have never been in a room with them. Their brother comes up in every second story and has never once been at a dinner you attended. Nothing has been refused, no meeting has been declined, the introduction has simply never happened, and the not happening is so undramatic that it has never come up as a subject between you. People sort their lives into compartments, and most of the sorting is unconscious. The walls go up early, and nobody inspects them afterward. Some of it is entirely reasonable. Work people and family people rarely mix well, and a person who keeps them apart is often just avoiding an evening that would exhaust everybody involved. But when a compartment holds somebody you have heard about for years and never seen, something is being managed. Sometimes it is you being protected from them. Sometimes it is them being protected from you. And sometimes the two versions of the person do not match, and putting the audiences in the same room would require choosing which one is the real one. That last case is the one worth knowing about, because it means the version you are getting has an edge to it. It is not a lie. It is a selection, maintained by keeping the witnesses apart. The test is soft and costs nothing at all. Suggest meeting them once, warmly, without any weight on it. Watch what happens to the suggestion. It will either become a plan, or it will become a series of reasons. And if it becomes reasons, notice whether you ever hear the same one twice, since a genuinely new obstacle each time is a very different signal from the same tired excuse, simply recycled. What is missing from their home? You have been in somebody's flat a dozen times. It is comfortable, it is clean, there is nothing wrong with it. Then one evening, you notice there are no photographs anywhere, or no books, or nothing at all on any wall, in a place somebody has lived in for 6 years. The absence has been in front of you the entire time, and you have never once looked at it, because absences do not attract the eye the way objects do. The mind counts what is present and has no method for counting what is not. A home is an unedited statement. Nobody is performing for a room they sit in alone. Nobody decorates for visitors after the first month, so what is there and what is not are both honest. No photographs can mean a person who is not sentimental, and it can equally mean somebody for whom the past is not a comfortable thing to have on the wall. Nothing personal at all, in a place lived in for years, usually means a life that has been treated as temporary for a long time, whether or not the person would ever describe it that way. Be careful, because it is easy to build a whole psychology out of an empty wall, and plenty of people simply do not think about walls. What makes it worth reading is the mismatch. Somebody expressive, warm, full of stories, living in rooms that say nothing about them, is worth wondering about gently. Look around your own place, as though you had never been there before. What is not in it is the part you have never had to explain to anybody, which is exactly why it has managed to stay invisible for as long as it actually has. The compliment they never give. Somebody is generous with praise. They notice your clothes, your cooking, the way you handle difficult people. And after a while, you realize there is one area they have never mentioned, and it happens to be the thing you care about most, the work you have been building for a decade. Nothing negative has ever been said about it. It simply does not exist in their vocabulary about you. There is a silence exactly the size of the thing you are proudest of. Selective praise is rarely planned, and almost nobody could tell you they were doing it. Praise flows toward whatever a person finds unthreatening. It is cheap where nothing is at stake and expensive where something is. When somebody withholds it in one specific area, that area is usually where the comparison lives. It is the place where your success touches something they wanted, or gave up on, or believed they should have done better at. And admiring you there costs something that admiring your cooking does not. There is a completely innocent version that accounts for a great many cases. Some people cannot praise what they do not understand, and if your work is genuinely opaque to them, silence is honesty rather than envy. The difference shows in curiosity. Somebody who does not understand but cares will ask questions about it. Somebody managing a comparison will not ask either. The silence extends to the questions, and that is the part that gives it away. Notice where the silence sits rather than counting the compliments. And notice where your own praise dries up because there is somewhere, and whatever is standing there is worth looking at honestly, while nobody else is watching you do it. Without any audience left to perform a generosity you do not actually feel. Who is absent from their stories? Listen to somebody describe their own childhood for an hour, and their mother turns out to be in every scene. Their father is mentioned twice, both times only to establish where the family lived, or the reverse. Or the years between 18 and 25 arrive with no friends in them at all, only jobs and cities. Nothing is being concealed. The stories are honest. But the cast list is not complete, and the omissions are not random. Somebody has been left standing outside the story for years. People edit their own history without noticing, and the editing follows feeling. Whoever is hard to feel about becomes hard to mention. Somebody who has been left out of the story is usually somebody who is difficult to place. Not necessarily a villain, more often a person who is absent, or disappointing in a way that has never been resolved, or so complicated to explain that leaving them out is easier than the alternative. Grief works the same way, and the recently dead often disappear from stories entirely for a year or two before they return. What this gives you is a map of where the difficult material is, without asking a single intrusive question. It also tells you which relationships have been settled and which have not, because settled ones can be mentioned casually and unsettled ones cannot. An easy mention is the sign that the work was already done. Do not go looking. Absent people in somebody's stories are absent for a reason, and the reason usually arrives on its own eventually, at 2 a.m, years later. Just notice who is not there, and be gentle when they finally appear, since whatever kept them off stage for this long was never a small thing to begin with, and rarely resolves itself neatly inside a single conversation, however well-intentioned that conversation turns out to be. What they refuse, help with. Somebody accepts a lift, a loan, a hand with the shopping. Then you offer help with the one thing they are visibly struggling with, and it is declined instantly, warmly, and completely. They are fine. It is under control. It is not worth your time. The refusal is faster than the acceptance was, and that difference in speed is the whole signal. Nobody has to think about the offers they intend to accept. Accepting help means being seen mid-difficulty, and everybody has one area where that is intolerable. Not difficult. Intolerable, in a way that produces a refusal before any thinking happens. For some it is money, for some it is work, for some it is anything at all involving their children or their health. The area is not chosen. It is wherever the person's sense of being adequate is stored, and letting somebody in there feels less like receiving help and more like an admission. Watch the mismatch between how much they help others and how much they will accept. Somebody who gives constantly and takes nothing is not being generous in the way it appears. They have arranged things so that they are never the one in debt, and that arrangement is protective rather than kind, though it looks identical from outside. The giving is real, And it is also a wall built out of good deeds. The way in is not to offer harder. Offering harder reads as pressure and gets refused faster. It is to ask them for something small first and to let them be the one who gave. The account balances differently after that, and the next offer sometimes lands where the earlier ones did not, simply because the ground has already been quietly, carefully prepared for it by everything that came before. The invitation that never comes. You hear about the dinner afterward. Not pointedly. Nobody is being cruel. It simply comes up in conversation the following week. Then it happens again a month later. Nothing has been said, nothing has been refused, and there is no moment you could raise without sounding as though you had been keeping score. There are two entirely different situations that look identical from where you are standing. You cannot tell them apart from the outside, and that is the whole difficulty. In one, you are not in that category of the person's life, and you never were. Friendships have categories, and most people have a group they see at home and a group they see elsewhere. And being in the second is not a demotion. It is just a fact nobody says out loud. Most people are in the second category for most of their friends. In the other, something has shifted and the invitations stopped. And the ending of a friendship is almost always administered this way, rather than announced. It is the only method that requires nobody to say anything unkind. The difference is history. If you were never invited, that is a category. If you used to be, that is information. Almost nobody checks which one they are looking at because checking requires asking, and asking feels humiliating. So the question sits there for years, quietly costing far more than the answer ever would have. There is a way through that costs less than it seems. Invite them instead. Once, without ceremony. What comes back is usually clear enough, and it saves you the years people spend quietly rearranging themselves around a silence they never once tested, when a single plain question, asked without ceremony, would have settled the whole thing in an afternoon. What they never apologize for. Somebody apologizes easily. Late, forgot, misread the message, sorry. They are good at it, and they mean it. The apologies are quick, unforced, and entirely genuine when they come. Then there is one category of thing where an apology has never once appeared, not in years, and it is almost always the category that costs you the most. Apologies are cheapest where the stakes are lowest. The cost is not in the word, it is in what has to be true afterward. Saying sorry for being late requires no revision of anything, but apologizing for how somebody speaks to you when they are angry requires them to accept that a part of them is a problem, and that is a different kind of transaction entirely. So the small ones arrive freely and the large one never does. And the fluency of the small ones makes the gap almost invisible. Somebody who apologizes constantly cannot easily be accused of never apologizing. The absence is rarely deliberate. Most people cannot see the category they will not enter, because not seeing it is the whole point of the arrangement. If you name it directly, you will usually be met with genuine confusion, followed by an apology for something adjacent to it. That apology will be sincere, and it will land somewhere else entirely. Track what has never been apologized for. Not to build a case, which helps nobody, but because that list is a fairly exact description of what this relationship will never resolve. And look at your own, because there is a category you will not enter either, and somebody has been living patiently beside it for a very long time without ever once demanding that you finally step inside and say the actual thing out loud. The hours you never hear about. You know what somebody does on a Saturday, and at work, and in the evening when you are together. Then there are the hours nobody accounts for. Sunday afternoons, the 2 hours between finishing and coming home. Early mornings on weekdays. Nothing suspicious is happening, almost certainly. And yet after a year you notice there is a portion of their week you have simply never heard described. It was never hidden. It was never mentioned either. The unaccounted hours are usually where the private self lives, and everybody has one. It is the part of a life that has no audience, and therefore needs no version. It might be a habit they are slightly embarrassed by. It might be a walk they take alone that they cannot explain the importance of. It might be somebody they visit. Very often it is nothing at all, and the hours are genuinely empty. And the emptiness is the thing they will not say out loud, because it sounds like failure. What matters here is the difference between privacy and concealment, and the difference is smaller than people think. Privacy has no tension around it. It is simply uninteresting. If you ask casually, you get a casual answer, even a boring one. Concealment produces a slight adjustment, a fractionally better answer than the question deserved. The distinction is not a moral one. Everybody is entitled to unaccounted hours, and a relationship where every hour is reported is not intimacy. It is surveillance. Notice your own. Whatever you do in the hours nobody asks about is closer to who you actually are than most of what fills the rest of the week, precisely because nobody was ever watching closely enough to shape it into something more presentable. What they never let you see, somebody is entirely open. They tell you difficult things, they cry in front of you, they admit to being frightened. And still, after all of it, there is a room you have never been in. You cannot name it, and you have no evidence for it. You simply know, in the way people know these things, that the openness has a boundary, and you have never been past it. The boundary is soft, and it does not move. Disclosure and access are not the same, and this catches almost everybody out. Being told a great deal is not the same as being let in. A person can hand you a great deal of material about themselves while keeping the one thing that would actually change how you see them, and the sheer volume of what has been shared works as cover. It is far easier to hide something behind honesty than behind silence, because silence draws attention and honesty closes the subject. A person who has told you everything is rarely asked what is left. What is usually being kept is not a scandal. It is more often a self-assessment, something they believe about themselves that they have never said to anybody and probably never will. And the belief is usually harsher than anything you would have concluded on your own. There is nothing to do about this and no way to get in, and attempting it will only close the door properly. Some of it is not yours. That is allowed. Notice the boundary rather than testing it, and notice your own, and how much you have arranged to sit comfortably just in front of it, close enough to feel generous about it without ever once risking the actual crossing yourself. The plan they never make. The future comes up constantly in conversation with this particular person. Places they want to see, things they intend to do, how it will be when the difficult period is over. Then one day you realize that in 4 years, not one of these has ever become a date, a booking, or a saved amount of money. Nothing was ever promised, so nothing was ever broken. There is nothing to raise and nobody to be disappointed in. There is simply a category of future that gets described endlessly and never once approached. Talking about a future does real work, which is precisely why it does not need to be pursued. It relieves the pressure of the present, it produces the feeling of movement, and it costs nothing at all. Describing a place is nearly as satisfying as booking one, and considerably safer. A plan, by contrast, can fail, and failing at a thing you actually attempted is much worse than never getting to it. So the description becomes a substitute, and the substitution is never noticed, because it is genuinely pleasant for everyone involved. Be careful about judging this. It is one of the gentler things people do to survive a long year. Everybody has one of these, and for a great many people, it is harmless, a private film that makes a hard year lighter. The read that matters is whether anything ever crosses over. Somebody with 10 described futures and 1 real plan is fine. Somebody with 10 described futures and none is telling you, without meaning to, that beginning is the frightening part rather than failing. Notice which of your own futures has never once been given a real date, and how long you have been describing it instead of simply, finally, beginning it. The goodbye that was never said. Somebody is simply not in your life anymore. There was no argument, no falling out, no conversation of any kind. Messages got slower and then stopped, and at some point the last one was the last one, and neither of you knew it at the time. Years later, you still could not say what happened, because nothing happened. There is no event to remember, and therefore nothing to grieve properly. This is how most relationships actually end, and almost nothing prepares anybody for it. People expect endings to have a shape, because the endings that get told as stories have one, and the quiet ones never get told at all. Nobody tells a story about a message that was not sent. So a person can lose a decade-long friendship and have no account of it, which is far harder to carry than a clean break would have been. What makes the silent ending so common is that it requires no courage from anybody. Saying goodbye means saying that something is over in front of the other person and taking whatever comes back. Fading requires nothing and can always be denied, even to yourself, because there is always a version where you are simply both busy. That version is available to both of you forever. The kindness available here is small, but real. It costs one message. If somebody has faded from your life and you would want them back, one message with no accusation in it will resolve it in either direction within a week. And if you are the one fading, consider whether that person deserves to be told plainly, rather than left to quietly work it out alone for years, wondering, without ever quite asking, what they did wrong. The thing they cannot stop doing. Apologies have been offered for it, more than once, sincerely. Promises to change it have followed. They may have gone to some trouble about it, read something, talked to somebody, genuinely meant every word of it. And a year later it is still happening, in the same shape, at the same moments. The lateness, the overworking, the disappearing for 3 days, the drinking that is not quite a problem. When something survives sincere effort, it is not a habit. It is doing a job. Whatever it does reliably, and reliability is hard to give up. Every persistent behavior is solving something, and it usually solves it well, which is exactly why it has outlasted every attempt to remove it. Lateness protects somebody from arriving somewhere they do not want to be. Overworking answers a question about worth that nothing else has managed to answer. Disappearing restores a sense of control to a person who feels managed the rest of the time. Nobody could tell you any of this, because the solving happens far below the level where explanations live. The mistake almost everybody makes is treating the behavior as the problem. It is not the problem. It is the answer to a problem. And removing the answer without addressing the question simply produces a different answer, usually a worse one. The vacancy gets filled within months. This is why so many people replace one thing with another and feel no better afterward. Look at what a persistent behavior protects rather than at what it costs. And look at your own, the one you have promised to stop for years, and ask what would actually be uncovered underneath it if you finally did, and whether, honestly, you are ready to meet what is waiting there. What they are always defending. Every person has a position they will defend, regardless of the subject in front of them. It might be that they work harder than anyone else realizes, that nobody ever helped them, that they are easygoing, that they are nothing like their father. Whatever the conversation happens to be about, this claim finds a way into it, and after enough time you notice the conversation quietly bending to make room for it. What gets defended constantly is never secure. Certainty is quiet. It has no need of an audience. Nobody argues for something they simply know. A person who is genuinely relaxed does not mention it, and a person who is actually helped along the way has no need to establish otherwise. The defense exists because the opposite is a live possibility inside them, and each conversation is a small opportunity to settle it, which never quite works, which is why it needs repeating. The argument runs again next week, with a different subject in front of it. This gives you something useful and something dangerous. The useful part is that you now know where the tender place is, and you can stop stepping on it by accident, which was probably causing arguments neither of you could explain. The dangerous part is that you also know exactly where to aim if you ever wanted to hurt them, and knowing that is a responsibility rather than a weapon. Notice what you defend when nobody has attacked it. It came out unprompted, in a conversation about something else, and it has been coming out for years, and it points directly at the thing you have never once managed to be fully sure of, no matter how many times you have quietly argued the case to yourself in the privacy of your own head. The fear under every choice. Take somebody you know well, and lay their last 10 significant decisions side by side. The jobs taken and refused, the relationships ended and endured, where they live, who they avoid, what they will not risk. Read the decisions as a single list rather than as separate events, and something appears that no individual choice would ever have shown you. One shape, running underneath all of them, in every single one. Most lives are organized around one fear, not a phobia and not anything dramatic. Being left, being trapped, being seen as stupid, being ordinary, being a burden. One of those, usually, and only one. The fear is usually formed early. It is rarely spoken about, and once it is running, it quietly influences every choice with enough weight to bend a whole life around it. Somebody afraid of being trapped will leave good situations early and call it restlessness. Somebody afraid of being left will stay in bad ones and call it loyalty. Both will describe their lives as a series of unrelated accidents. What makes this so hard to see from inside is that each individual decision has excellent reasons attached to it. The job really was wrong. The relationship really was difficult. The reasons are true, and they are also downstream of something that was decided long ago. Only the pattern gives it away, and patterns are invisible to the person living inside them. Do this for yourself, honestly, on paper. 10 decisions in a row. Whatever they have in common is the thing that has been quietly writing your life. Most people go an entire lifetime without ever looking at the list, and live out the shape of it anyway, described to themselves comfortably as nothing more than a long run of unrelated coincidences. How they behave with no audience. An empty car park at midnight with a trolley to return. A cashier who has given too much change. An empty street and a piece of rubbish in your hand. Nobody is watching. Nothing will be reported, and there is no version of the moment that anybody else will ever see. What happens in those moments is not a small thing. It is closer to the whole thing. Everything else you have observed about this person had a witness. Almost all behavior is negotiated with an audience, even an imagined one, and most people are decent in public because being seen to be decent has real value. Remove the audience and the value goes with it, so whatever remains is running on something else entirely, which is usually a private idea a person holds about who they are. That idea was not built for anybody else and does not need approving. That idea is far more stable than manners and far more predictive of what they will do when something matters. There is a version of this that gets overrated. Somebody who returns the trolley is not therefore trustworthy with your money. And the leap from small, unobserved kindness to large moral reliability is bigger than people assume. Read it as evidence rather than as proof. What is genuinely worth watching is the mismatch. Somebody impeccable in company and careless when nobody is looking is telling you where their standards actually live, which is in the eyes of others rather than in themselves. That is not villainy. It is simply where the standard is kept. And whatever you do in an empty car park is what you actually believe, in a way that no amount of good behavior performed for an audience can ever quite substitute for. The same story in every relationship. Listen to somebody describe 4 relationships and count the shape rather than the people. All 4 partners were cold, or all 4 were unstable, or all 4 eventually stopped appreciating them. The names change, the cities change, the endings arrive at roughly the same distance from the beginning. And every account is accurate. Nobody is exaggerating, and nobody is inventing anything. That is exactly what makes this so difficult to say to anybody. Repetition of this kind almost never means the person chose badly 4 separate times. It means something in them recognizes a particular kind of person as familiar, and familiar registers as right long before any thinking happens. Whatever the original arrangement was, usually formed in a house before anybody had words for it, the nervous system keeps looking for a version of it, because a known difficulty is easier to inhabit than an unknown ease. The familiar version at least comes with instructions. What complicates it further is that people also produce the pattern rather than only finding it. Somebody expecting to be abandoned will test constantly, and enough testing will eventually produce the abandonment they expected, and the whole thing will look from inside like confirmation. Nobody in that loop is being dishonest about their experience. They are simply reporting the second half of something they started. Do not offer this to anybody as a diagnosis. It lands as an accusation, and it will be defended for years. But do count the shapes in your own history, honestly, without softening the count for anybody's sake. 4 of anything is not luck. And the common element in every relationship you have ever had is standing exactly where you are standing now, reading this, tired, in the quiet dark. What they were never given. Somebody praises constantly, far more than any situation requires, to everybody around them. Somebody else can never leave a room without checking that everyone in it is all right. Somebody insists on paying, always, every single time, in a way that has started to be uncomfortable. Watch what a person gives away most freely, and you are usually looking at the thing they most needed and did not receive. The generosity has an address on it, and the address is somewhere 30 years back. It is one of the more reliable patterns in adult life, and one of the least visible from inside it. The child who is never reassured becomes an adult who reassures. The one whose feelings were never asked about becomes the person always asking. The one nobody ever protected becomes the one who protects everybody. What is being given is a repair, offered outward because it cannot be offered backward, and it is genuine even though it is compensatory. That is worth holding on to, because it is easy to hear this and conclude. The generosity is somehow fake. It is not fake. It is simply aimed at more than one thing at once. There is a cost, and it is usually paid quietly. Giving in one direction only is exhausting in a way nobody sees. People who give what they never got are frequently terrible at receiving it, and will deflect the exact thing they hand out most freely. Offer reassurance to a reassurer and watch it bounce straight off. Notice what you give away too easily. Then ask who was supposed to give it to you first, long before you learn to give it to everyone else instead, and whether you ever actually got it from them at all, or simply learned to stop expecting it somewhere along the way. The rule they have never broken. Everybody carries a small private code, most of it unremarkable, and one line in it is absolute. Never be late. Never owe anybody. Never lose your temper in front of a child. Never let anyone see you cry. The rule is rarely stated, and it is never negotiable. And if you happen to press on it, the reaction will be out of all proportion to whatever was actually happening at the time. Absolute rules are almost always monuments. Something is buried underneath them, and the rule is what was put on top. Something happened, or was witnessed, and the rule was built afterward to make sure it never happens again. The person who will not be late once watched somebody be humiliated for it. The person who will not owe anybody watched a family come apart over money. Because the rule was formed at the moment of the injury, it does not update, and it operates at full strength decades later in situations that have nothing in common with the original one. It fires at full volume in a room where nothing is at stake. What it gives you is a location. When somebody's reaction is enormously larger than the event, you are standing on top of a rule, and the size of the reaction is telling you about the size of what it was built to prevent. Do not argue with it in the moment. The rule is older than the argument. Nothing you say will be heard, because you are not talking to the present. And find your own. Everybody has one, and behind it is a scene you have probably not thought about in years, though your body has clearly never once forgotten it, and, by the look of things, never really will. What they do with power, not a large amount of it. Small, ordinary power, which is the only kind most people ever hold. Nobody in your life is going to be handed a country, and it would tell you nothing extra. Somebody becomes the one who decides the restaurant, holds the keys, controls the schedule, is owed a favor, is briefly in charge of something that matters. That first week is the most informative week you will ever spend with a person, because character does not appear under pressure nearly as clearly as it appears under permission. Pressure is what people prepare for. Permission arrives without warning. Pressure narrows people and mostly makes them the same. Permission does the opposite. When somebody is suddenly allowed to have their way without consequence, what emerges is whatever they have wanted and been unable to take. It has been waiting, and now there is no reason to keep waiting. Some people barely change at all. Some become gentler and start checking, and are visibly uncomfortable holding it. And some expand into it immediately, in a way that surprises everybody who thought they knew them, and afterward, it is impossible to unsee. The unfair version of this read is treating any enjoyment of power as a defect. Plenty of people enjoy it and use it well, and somebody who wanted responsibility is not a tyrant for having wanted it. The signal is what happens to the people below them. Watch whether the smallest ones get easier or harder to reach. Access is the measure. Everything else is decoration. And watch yourself in the week you are the one holding the keys. That week comes around more often than anybody admits, in rooms far smaller and far more ordinary than the ones this particular topic has been describing. The age they stopped at. Every person has one moment in their life that stayed. Not the most important one. the one that never closed. The year everything was decided, the year it went wrong, the year they were most themselves. It shows up in the music they still return to, the era they describe in the most detail, the argument they are still having with somebody who is no longer in the room. Whatever age it is, part of them is still there, and it comes out most clearly under stress. Take away the resources, and the age underneath shows through. This is not immaturity, and it is not a failure of any kind. Something happened at that age that was never finished, and the mind keeps a live connection to unfinished things. Unfinished things do not age. They wait. If a person was left at 19, some of their responses at 45 will be a 19-year-old's responses, and the intelligence of the intervening decades will not have touched them at all. It is why an otherwise formidable adult can be reduced to something much younger by one specific kind of moment. You have seen this happen, and you have probably never known what you were looking at. Watch for the discrepancy rather than for the age. When a reaction does not match the person, when somebody capable becomes suddenly small or suddenly wild, you have found the year. Be careful with it, because that is the most defended part of anybody. Nothing gets protected harder than an unfinished year. Find your own, honestly. There is a year you keep returning to, and something in it is still waiting to be finished, patiently, regardless of how many other, busier years have since been quietly added on top of it. How they explain their own life. Ask somebody how they ended up here, in this job, this city, this life, and listen to the grammar of the answer rather than to the facts. Some people give you a series of decisions they made. Some give you a series of things that happened to them. Some give you luck in either direction. 3 people, 3 grammars, 1 kind of life. The events are usually accurate. The frame around them is entirely chosen, and it was chosen so long ago that it no longer feels like a choice at all. It feels like an accurate description of what took place. This is the deepest read available to you, because the frame does not just describe a life, it produces the next part of it. Somebody who narrates their history as things that happened will approach the next decision as something to wait for. Somebody who narrates it as decisions will approach it as something to make, even where they have very little room. Both are partly true, since every life is a mixture, and the mixture is never as one-sided as the telling. The telling is where the person adds themselves. The frame is also the hardest thing in a person to change, because it is not a belief about the world, it is the shape of the container everything else arrives in. You cannot argue somebody out of it. It is not held as an opinion, so it cannot be answered as one. What you can do is notice which one you have. Tell the story of your own last 10 years out loud and listen closely to who is doing the acting in the sentences, and who, instead, is only ever standing quietly to one side, receiving things that simply happen to them. The one thing they cannot hear. There is a piece of feedback that this person cannot receive from anybody, in any wording, at any time. Everything else lands. They will take almost anything you have to say without flinching. They can be told they were wrong, that they were unfair, that the plan is bad. But there is one sentence that arrives and does not get in, and instead produces a reaction that ends the conversation entirely. Everybody has one. It is usually the thing they most quietly suspect is true. That is why it cannot be allowed through the door. Feedback that is clearly false is easy to hear, because it can be dismissed. Feedback that confirms something a person already fears about themselves cannot be dismissed, so it has to be prevented instead. And the prevention shows up as anger, or tears, or a sudden cold reasonableness that makes further discussion impossible. The strength of the defense is proportional to the accuracy. Nobody builds a wall around an empty field. This is the single most useful thing to know about somebody you live or work with, and the most dangerous. The two are the same fact. Useful, because it explains a conversation you have been failing to have for years. Dangerous, because it is also the exact sentence that would do the most damage, and the fact that you now know it does not entitle you to say it. Some knowledge is only for holding. Find your own. It is the criticism you have been dismissing for years as unfair, from several different people, none of whom knew each other. That last detail, the strangers who all somehow said the same thing without ever comparing notes, is the one actually worth sitting with quietly tonight, longer than you might otherwise choose to. The person they are still proving wrong. Somewhere behind a driven adult there is usually one specific person. A father who said they would not amount to much. A teacher who put them in the lower set. Somebody who left. The person may be dead, may be entirely unaware, may have said it once in a bad mood 40 years ago. It does not matter at all. The sentence was said once and has been running ever since. The work has been addressed to them ever since. This is one of the most productive engines a human being can run on and one of the worst to be inside. It produces genuine achievement, sustained across decades because the fuel never runs out. Nothing exhausts a person less reliably than something they cannot resolve. Nothing is ever enough, since the audience is not present to be satisfied, and so each success is followed by a short, flat silence, and then the next thing. Watch for the flatness after somebody's wins. It arrives about an hour after the congratulations do. That is where you can see it most clearly. Nobody chooses this, and almost nobody can name it, because from inside, it simply feels like ambition. The version that hurts to notice is when the person is now proving it to somebody who no longer exists, and has been for 20 years, and would be genuinely free if they ever stopped. The ending was available decades ago, and nobody mentioned it. Ask yourself who your own work is addressed to, not who benefits from it, who is meant to see it. The answer arrives quickly, and it is almost never the person you would have named out loud if somebody had simply asked you yesterday, before tonight's quiet accounting finally caught up with you. The thing you knew in the first week. There is a person in your life about whom you formed an impression very early, in the first week or the first evening, and then spent 2 years being talked out of it. Not by them, by yourself. The impression arrived without evidence. It seemed unfair, and it did not fit the person you wanted them to be. So you set it aside as a prejudice and got on with things. And then, eventually, it turned out to be exactly right. This happens to almost everybody, and the mechanism is not mysterious. The early read was assembled from hundreds of small signals you could not name, delivered before anybody had reason to manage themselves around you. Everything afterward arrived with the volume turned down, because by then, they knew you were watching. The first week was the only week you saw them unmanaged. Everything since has been a negotiation between the two of you. What overrides the read is rarely evidence. It is usually hope or need or the perfectly decent instinct not to condemn somebody on a feeling. That instinct is worth keeping. It simply should not have a vote for 2 years. The useful thing is not to trust every first impression, since plenty are wrong and some are only your own history arriving early. It is to write it down, not to act on, only to keep. One sentence, somewhere private, on the day it arrives. Then leave it alone. In a year, you will either have learned something about that person or something about yourself. And either way, you will have a record, rather than a feeling, you quietly talked yourself out of, somewhere along the way, for reasons that felt generous, even kind, at the time. Why you kept asking other people. You have described the same situation to 4 friends. You have laid out the details, asked what they thought, listened carefully, and then gone away and done nothing at all. A month later, you described it again to somebody else, in the same words, having discovered nothing new. The friends were kind. None of it moved anything. From outside, it looks like a person gathering information. It is not that. Repeatedly asking for advice about a decision you have not made usually means the decision is already made, and you are looking for permission. The knowing is uncomfortable. The consequences are expensive, and so you go around the outside of it, hoping somebody will say the sentence that makes it acceptable to do the thing you have already chosen. This is why the advice never helps. Nobody can give permission for something they are not going to live inside. The only person who can authorize it is the one who will pay for it. There is a version of this that is genuinely useful, and it is easy to tell apart. Real uncertainty produces different questions each time, because each answer moves you somewhere new. Permission-seeking produces the same question, told in the same way, with the same details emphasized. Listen to how you tell it. The wording is the evidence. If the story has not changed in 6 months, you are not deciding anything. You are rehearsing. Notice which friend you have not asked, out of everyone you could have called. There is usually one, and it is usually the one who would say the true thing. And the fact that you have quietly avoided them for this long is itself the clearest, most honest answer available to you The evidence you threw away. It was not that you missed anything. That is the part people get wrong when they look back and call themselves naive. You saw it. The comment at the dinner, the way they spoke to the waiter, the story about the last job that did not quite hold together. You noticed every one of them at the time, and then you found a reason. And the reason was always available because reasons always are. People do not miss red flags. They file them. Filing is not the same as ignoring. It takes work, and it feels like maturity. Each individual piece of evidence is genuinely explainable, and explaining it takes almost no effort, and the explanation is often even true. Anybody can have a bad evening. Anybody can be short with a waiter once. That is entirely true, and it is exactly what makes it usable. The filing only becomes visible in aggregate, and by then you have 20 explained incidents and no memory of having explained anything, because each act of explaining felt like fairness rather than avoidance. This is why hindsight feels so brutal. It is not that the information arrives late. It arrives exactly on time and gets processed by somebody who wanted a different answer. There is one habit that changes this, and it is very small. When you find yourself constructing an explanation for somebody's behavior, notice that you are doing it. Not to stop, just to notice. The noticing is free, it changes nothing tonight, and it accumulates. If you catch yourself doing it 3 times in a month for the same person, you have not been unlucky. You have been busy, quietly and diligently, doing the patient work of not seeing something you had, in fact, already fully seen. What your body knew before you did. There is a tightening that happens when a certain name appears on your phone. A specific fatigue that arrives about an hour before you have to see somebody. A held breath in a room where nothing is wrong. Your body has been keeping a record the entire time, and it has never once been asked to justify itself, which is precisely why it is worth reading. It has no reputation to protect and nothing to be fair about. The nervous system runs a faster and cruder assessment than thought does. It works on pattern rather than reason. It does not care about fairness, and it has no interest whatsoever in the story you have agreed to tell about somebody. So, it registers what actually happens rather than what is supposed to be happening. And it goes on registering for years while the conscious version of you is still giving somebody the benefit of the doubt. This is not mysticism, and it is not always right. Bodies produce false alarms constantly, and a person can carry dread about somebody entirely undeserving of it because they resemble somebody else. The signal is not a verdict. It is data you have been discarding. It is also the only data collected before you decided what you wanted to be true. Do the simplest possible version of this. Think through the people you will see this week and notice what happens in your chest at each name. Do not act on any of it. Nothing needs deciding tonight. Just notice which name changed something in your chest and how long you have known, and how carefully, for how long, you have avoided knowing it in so many actual spoken words. Who you stopped being around them. Around one particular person you are noticeably less funny than you actually are. Somebody around whom you do not mention certain things anymore. Somebody whose presence makes you slightly more careful, slightly more agreeable, slightly smaller, in a way that has never once been discussed and would sound absurd if you tried to describe it out loud. Nothing was ever done to you. There is no incident to name. Relationships shape people quietly. Everybody adjusts around everybody, and most of it is healthy and entirely ordinary. But some adjustments are subtractions, and subtractions accumulate. Nobody adds anything back without being asked. A subject that produced a bad reaction once gets avoided the next time, and then it stops occurring to you at all. And after a few years, there is a whole area of yourself that simply does not appear in that person's company. You did not decide this. It happened one small avoidance at a time. Each one was reasonable on the day it was made. The clearest way to see it is by comparison, rather than by introspection. Think about how you are with the person you find easiest, then hold that beside how you are with the person you find hardest. The gap is not a description of you. It is a description of what each relationship permits. The same person produced both versions, which is the part worth sitting with. And the honest question underneath it is not whether they did something wrong. Often nobody did. Some people are simply expensive to be near, without any fault in it. It is whether the version of yourself that shows up in that company is one you would actually want to spend another whole decade quietly being, without complaint, without ever once being asked to explain why. What you have already decided. Somewhere in you there is a conclusion that has been fully formed for some time. About a job, a friendship, a place you live, a person you keep making room for. You have not said it out loud, possibly not even to yourself in a complete sentence, and yet everything about how you behave suggests it was settled a while ago. You have stopped making plans in that direction. You have started saying we will see. You have stopped arguing about it, which is the clearest sign of all. Decisions are usually made long before they are announced. The announcing is a separate and much harder act because announcing makes it real and creates consequences, while the decision itself can sit quietly for years, costing nothing visible to anybody. It costs plenty, just nothing anybody could point at. So people live in a strange middle state, having decided and not having acted, and they mistake the discomfort of that state for uncertainty about the decision. It is not uncertainty. It is the weight of the announcement. Those two feel identical from inside, and they are not the same thing. The test is simple and slightly uncomfortable. Imagine somebody tells you the choice has been taken out of your hands and the thing is now definitely over. Watch what happens in the first second, before any thinking. If what arrives is relief, you have your answer, and you had it long before tonight. Nothing has to be done about it now. It will still be true in the morning. But it is worth knowing the difference between a decision you have genuinely not made and one you have simply not yet found the nerve to say out loud to anyone at all, including yourself, in the dark. The conversation you keep rehearsing. You have had it 40 times. In the shower, in the car, at 3 in the morning when you should be asleep. You know your opening line. You know what they will say. You have prepared a response to that, and you have never once had the conversation in real life. You are extremely good at it by now. Some of these rehearsals have been running for years, and a few of them are with people you no longer speak to at all. A rehearsed conversation is unfinished business that has nowhere to go. It cannot be finished and it cannot be dropped, so it circles. The mind keeps returning to it for the same reason it returns to any incomplete thing, and every rehearsal makes it slightly more solid, until the imagined version has more detail in it than most of your actual memories. It also gets worse over time rather than better, because in rehearsal you always get sharper and they always get harder, and the gap between the version in your head and anything that could really happen widens every year. This is why so many of these conversations become impossible to have. The real one could never match. Nothing said in a kitchen could carry what 40 rehearsals have loaded onto it. What helps is not usually having it. Most of these conversations should not happen, and the ones that should have happened were needed years ago. What helps is naming what the rehearsal is trying to obtain. Usually it is not agreement. It is being seen, as you actually were, by somebody who has been unable to do that from the very beginning, and probably never will manage it now, no matter how many more rehearsals get quietly added to the pile. How you are read by others. All 100 of the signs in this list run in both directions at once. Somebody has noticed which word you repeat, where your eyes go when you walk into a room, how quickly you fill a silence and what you reach for in an argument. They have not analyzed you deliberately, and they could not explain any of it if asked, but they know. They knew within a month, and they have not revised it much since. People generally know each other far better than they ever say. Most reading is never reported. Almost nothing anybody concludes about you will ever be said to your face. It sits in the background as a feeling about somebody, and it steers who gets invited, who gets trusted with something difficult, who gets the benefit of the doubt on a bad day. The people around you have been running the whole of this quietly for years, in your direction without a single word about it. That should be less frightening than it sounds. Almost nobody is building a case. People have their own lives to attend to. What people are actually doing is working out how to be around you, and most of what they have concluded is more generous than anything you would have concluded about yourself. The version of you they hold is usually kinder and far less detailed than the one in your head. What this changes is small. It removes the point of managing an impression that was formed anyway, from things you could not control, over a much longer period than any single performance covers. You were read a long time ago. Nothing you do this week will change it much, and there is no version of tonight where retracing every step of it would actually help. It went better than you think. What reading people cannot do. There is a limit to all of this, and it is worth saying plainly before the end. None of it tells you what somebody will do next. It tells you what has been true so far, which is a different thing. And people move. Somebody can spend 40 years unable to apologize and then learn how in a single year, usually because something happened that no observer could have predicted. The patterns are real, and they are not sentences. A pattern describes a road already traveled, not the one ahead. There is also a failure mode that comes with getting good at this, and it is worth watching for in yourself. Reading people can quietly become a way of staying outside them. If you are always the observer, always half a step back, always noticing rather than participating, you will be very accurate and not especially close to anybody. Accuracy is not intimacy, and it is easy to mistake one for the other. Analysis makes an excellent hiding place, and it looks like wisdom from the outside, which is exactly what makes it so easy to live in. The point of any of this was never to win, or to catch somebody out, or to be the one person in the room who is never surprised. It was to stop being confused. Confusion is what makes people exhausting, not difficulty. To spend less time wondering what a look meant and more time on the ordinary business of being with people. Use it to understand, and then put it down. It was never meant to be carried into every room. The best conversations of your life will happen when you have finally stopped reading anything at all and are simply, quietly, fully there, with nothing left to decode. The ones who were simple all along. Not everybody has a hidden layer. Most people do not. It is worth saying, because a list like this one can make the world look like a code. Some of the people in your life mean what they say, want what they ask for, and are not carrying anything complicated underneath it. When they seem tired, they are tired. When they say the evening was lovely, it was. There is nothing under it. You have probably spent time looking for a second meaning in somebody who never had one, and the looking cost you more than any misreading would have. Overreading is its own kind of error, quieter than the opposite one, but no less costly. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one, and often the kinder one too. It is also the kindest. Somebody was late because of traffic. Somebody was quiet because they had a headache. Whole friendships have been damaged by an interpretation that nobody needed. So keep the ordinary people in view. They are easy to undervalue precisely because they require no decoding at all. The people who were simple all along have often been the steadiest thing in your life, and you have probably thought about them far less over the years than about anybody who ever confused you. What you can stop watching for. There is a relief available at the end of all this, and it is not the relief of finally understanding everybody. It is that most of it does not need watching. You already know who is safe. You have known for a long time. That knowledge did not come from any of this. There are 2 or 3 people in your life whose behavior you have never once had to interpret, and you could name them without effort, lying exactly where you are. Around those people, none of this applies. The whole apparatus can be set down. That is what the reading was for, not to be used everywhere and forever, but to find where it is not needed, and rest there. Watching is expensive, and it has been quietly running in the background for years, in rooms where nothing about the people in them ever required it. But none of those rooms are here tonight. The room you are lying in. Nobody in this room needs reading. The signals have stopped for the day. Whatever anybody meant by what they said, it will still be there tomorrow, and it was never going to be solved tonight by somebody lying still in the dark. All the noticing can rest now. The people you were thinking about are asleep somewhere too, being simpler than you imagined. Very little of it was about you. It rarely is. Most of what you carried today belonged to somebody else and was handed to you without either of you noticing. You can put it down here. The room is quiet, the day is finished, and everything that still needed understanding will simply keep until morning. There is nothing left to read tonight.